Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we descend into the flickering candlelight of a medieval convent where not every prayer was pure and not every sin was punished. The walls are damp with centuries of whispers, and the scent of frankincense can't quite mask the aroma of something wilder: wine, fear, or perhaps the audacity of one woman who refused to kneel before hypocrisy. You probably won't survive this one without raising an eyebrow or two. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the ancient cloister gate, your footsteps echoing against the cold stones like hesitant confessions. The convent is supposed to be a place of silence, a sanctuary of souls devoted to prayer and simplicity. But here, you sense something else. The silence hums alive, restless, and oddly musical, as though the walls themselves remember laughter that should never have existed. In the courtyard, ivy curls like green gossip around statues of saints. Their marble eyes are cracked, weary of watching centuries of pious pretenses. Somewhere inside, a bell tolls, its sound rolling across the misty hills, summoning the sisters to vespers. But even the bell seems reluctant tonight, its chime more sigh than song. You follow the sound, entering the chapel. Candles flicker on the altar, and rows of nuns kneel like identical silhouettes, except one. She shifts slightly out of rhythm, her posture careless, her lips curving in what might be a smirk. Her hands clasp a rosary, but her fingers tap against the beads, as though keeping time to a melody no one else hears. That is her. The worst nun in medieval history, or so the chronicles claim. Her real name has been lost beneath layers of rumor and rebranding. Some call her Sister Benedetta, others Sister Seraphine. The Benedictines deny she ever existed. The Dominicans insist she was excommunicated twice. But every version agrees on one thing: she was trouble incarnate. And as you stand there, half hidden by the pillars, you can almost feel her presence brush against your sleeve, a ghostly flicker of irreverent energy. Historians still debate whether she was a real figure or a composite of several notorious nuns from across Europe, rebellious women whose lives were too scandalous for the church to record under their real names. Some say she lived in northern Italy during the 14th century, a time when plague and faith intertwined like lovers who couldn't stand each other. Others place her in France, where abbesses ruled estates like noblewomen and peasants whispered that convent walls hid more than prayers. But facts, as always, are only the bones. Tonight, we're chasing the pulse from the beating heart beneath the habit. Imagine it. A convent built in the 12th century, fortified like a castle, its stone corridors echoing with chants that were supposed to ward off sin. Yet, as you peer closer, you notice a small door near the apse, half concealed by a tapestry of the Virgin. Behind it lies a narrow passage leading to the kitchens, and from there, down into the wine cellar. You'll want to remember that door. The abbess, a formidable woman named Mother Agatha, was said to have run this house with an iron rosary. She had the authority of a bishop, the patience of a saint, and, according to local rumor, the temper of a blacksmith with a hangover. She insisted her nuns confess twice a week, fast 3 times a week, and never speak of the world beyond the convent gates, which, of course, guaranteed that everyone did exactly that. It's hard not to snicker. Medieval nuns were not the cloistered innocents of modern imagination. Many were daughters of nobles placed in convents not from divine calling but to save the family dowry or dodge unwanted marriages. They brought with them books, servants, and occasionally small dogs hidden under their cloaks. They also brought a dangerous combination of intelligence, idleness, and access to ink. When you confine bright young minds and forbid curiosity, it doesn't kill mischief, it refines it. That's how legends like hers are born. One winter night, a novice found a page of parchment under the refectory table. It bore a short Latin poem, not devotional, but scandalously human. It described the scent of apples in autumn, the warmth of a forbidden hand, the loneliness of cold stone. No name, just a single flourish at the bottom. S. The abbess was livid. The entire convent was interrogated. The culprit was never found. But from then on, more poems appeared slipped under prayer books, scribbled in the margins of psalters, even hidden in the folds of the choir robes. Each one was sharper, bolder, until one compared the Virgin Mary to a caged bird longing to fly. That was enough to summon a visiting bishop. He arrived expecting to find demonic possession. What he found instead was eloquence and mockery. During his sermon, he caught one nun rolling her eyes, her lips twitching in amusement. When he paused to glare, she met his gaze unflinching. Witnesses later swore she winked. That moment, they say, was when she crossed the invisible line between sinner and legend. The bishop left early the next morning, his robes dusty and his pride bruised. He wrote in his report, still preserved in an obscure ecclesiastical archive, that the devil has learned Latin and now wears a veil. De mein Nord, a mainstream historical fact. Medieval convents were often centers of education and artistic expression. Many women who could read and write at all did so behind convent walls. Some copied manuscripts. Others composed music or illuminated texts with gold and lapis. So it isn't impossible that one rebellious nun might also have been a poet, perhaps even a philosopher, who saw through the contradictions of her world. A quirky tidbit emerges from a local chronicle in Lombardy. It records that a certain sister brewed strong drink in the Lord's cellar and sold it to pilgrims disguised as holy water. No name again, but the timing fits, and the audacity certainly matches. You glance toward the chapel altar again. The candles sputter, as if stirred by her laughter, centuries old but still irreverent. She was, by every measure, a nightmare for the ecclesiastical hierarchy, clever enough to quote Augustine when scolded, bold enough to correct priests mid-sermon, and shameless enough to challenge a bishop to debate her interpretation of divine joy. Scarbacked, it's easy to see why she was erased from official history. Yet, erasure often works like embroidery. The harder you scrub, the more visible the outline becomes. Imagine her walking through the convent garden, her hands folded behind her back, humming a melody that sounds suspiciously like a tavern tune. The younger sisters whisper, but also secretly adore her. The older ones pray harder, as though each Ave Maria might smother the spark she carries. But sparks, as you know, have a habit of finding dry tinder, and she was surrounded by plenty. Beyond the walls, Europe was unraveling. The plague had decimated entire towns. Priests died faster than they could absolve. Faith faltered, fear replaced it. The church demanded obedience, and obedience grew brittle under pressure. In that chaos, one woman's defiance became both scandal and symbol. Historians still disagree on whether she ever faced formal charges of heresy. Some documents hint at a trial held in secret, perhaps under papal authority. Others suggest the abbess simply transferred her to another convent code for quiet exile. Whatever the truth, her name begins to vanish from records after 1349, right around the height of the Black Death. But rumors multiply. There's a parchment fragment, preserved in the Bibliotheca Ambrosiana, containing an unsigned letter addressed to the sister who laughs at angels. It praises her courage and calls her the mirror of our age. Some scholars dismiss it as satire. Others see it as evidence of a hidden correspondence network among literate women of the time, a kind of medieval samizdat, where nuns and laywomen exchanged forbidden ideas under the church's nose. If that's true, then our worst nun wasn't just rebellious, she was revolutionary. You pass beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with fading frescoes. A cherub peers down, its face chipped, but still mischievous. Somewhere in the distance, you hear faint music, plainchant, mingled with something more melodic, almost secular. You follow the sound until you reach a small wooden door. Behind it lies the scriptorium. Rows of desks, quills, parchment, inkpots. The air smells of dust and devotion. And on one desk, half covered by an unfinished manuscript, lies a single sentence written in a confident hand. Obedience without joy is not holiness, it is fear in a habit. One de Bess, pronaudibly made cond. You can almost hear her chuckle. For a moment, you wonder if she was ever afraid of damnation, of discovery, of her own daring. But fear, like faith, comes in many disguises. Maybe she felt both at once. Maybe the edge between courage and sin was the only place she ever felt alive. The bell tolls again, snapping you back to the present. The nuns file into the refectory, their shadows stretching long and thin under the torchlight. The rebellious one lingers behind, her face half-lit, eyes bright with the kind of mischief that could topple kingdoms or at least abbesses. She picks up her quill and writes something quickly, then hides the page under her sleeve. As she passes you, the faint scent of ink and spice lingers, a sensory relic from a world where even defiance had its perfume. Outside, rain begins to fall, washing over the convent walls, blurring stone and sky together. Somewhere, deep within the sound, you think you hear laughter again. Not cruel, not mocking, just free. And in that laughter, you realize why her story endures. It isn't because she was the worst. It's because she refused to pretend. In an age when obedience was survival, she chose honesty, even if it damned her. Centuries later, the church would quietly absorb her memory, smoothing her sharp edges into morality tales or ghost stories. But the truth, whatever it was, remained stubbornly alive in the spaces between history's official lines. As you step back into the courtyard, the ivy shivers in the breeze. The saints on their pedestals seem almost amused. Somewhere beyond the convent walls, thunder rolls like distant applause. You take one last look at the chapel, its stained glass catching the final glint of twilight. For a heartbeat, a figure moves behind the colored panes, a silhouette in a habit, head tilted in laughter. Then she's gone. But her story, your story now, is just beginning. You can picture her before the veil, barefoot in the courtyard of her father's estate, mud on her skirts and a scowl on her face, while the governess sighs into her rosary. The sun catches in her hair, too wild to be tamed by ribbons, and her laughter rings out like a dare. You were told noble daughters should embroider flowers and practice grace. She preferred climbing trees and arguing about theology she wasn't supposed to know. Her father, Lord Renaud of the Western Marches, tried everything short of exorcism. Tutors came and went, each one defeated, not by laziness, but by questions, sharp, unrelenting questions. Why must Eve take the blame for the apple, if God gave her curiosity? Why should a woman's virtue be guarded like a locked chest, while men parade theirs like banners? By 12, she'd already humiliated 3 priests and 1 overconfident friar. At meals, she refused to stay silent unless the topic was worth her tongue. Her mother called her the ungoverned soul. Her father called her the end of our peace. Servants whispered she was marked by the devil. Her nurse whispered she was marked by intelligence, which was often more dangerous. You can see her now kneeling in the chapel during morning mass, mouthing the Latin words she knows by heart, but replacing them with her own meaning. When the priest chants, Domine, non sum dignus, she mutters under her breath, then why make me kneel? And the saints on the stained glass windows, mute witnesses, seemed to wink in approval. Her world was narrow but gilded. A moat, a courtyard, a hall lined with ancestral portraits, all men, all grim. Beyond those walls lay the village with its muddy lanes, its market gossip, its ringing church bell. Sometimes she would sneak down there disguised in a servant's cloak, just to hear how the common folk spoke of God. They seemed freer, even in their misery. Their prayers sounded like conversations, not recitations. It made her wonder if salvation might be simpler than the church claimed. Historians still debate whether her family's wealth or her wit doomed her first. Some suggest she was too clever to be married off safely. No nobleman wanted a bride who quoted Augustine back at him during supper. Others say it was the family's debts that sealed her fate. The convent dowry was cheaper than a wedding. Whatever the reason, the decision was made for her before she was old enough to argue it. She overheard it one winter's night, standing outside her father's solar. Through the heavy oak door, voices murmured, her father's stern, her mother's brittle. She will never be content as a wife, her mother said. She will bring ruin if she stays, her father replied. A pause. Then, the abbess of Saint Genevieve owes me a favor. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply returned to her chamber, opened the window to the snow-choked garden, and whispered to the darkness. Then God will have to take me, as I am. We're game to speak in remention, a quirky tidbit preserved in one surviving ledger of the convent centuries later. Discovered by an archivist, lists her dowry: 1 silver crucifix, 3 woolen habits, a psalter bound in calfskin, and a sword of her brother's. The last item is crossed out in red ink, with the word inconvenience beside it, improper. That crossed-out sword tells you everything. When the day came for her departure, the household gathered in silence. She knelt before her father to receive his blessing, and he touched her forehead with trembling fingers. Obedience is a virtue, he said. You will learn peace there. She met his eyes. Then you have never met peace, father. The journey to St. Genevieve took 2 days. The carriage creaked through forests and over rivers swollen from spring thaw. She watched the world blur past bare trees, fields, villages where peasants stopped to stare. Freedom slipping away mile by mile. The convent rose on a hill like a fortress of faith. Its towers gray against the sky. Ravens wheeled above the gate, croaking as though mocking the solemnity of her arrival. Inside, everything smelled of wax and discipline. The abbess, Mother Agatha, greeted her with a thin smile and an inspection sharp enough to cut glass. "God will tame what the world could not," she said, to which the girl replied, perfectly politely, "Then he will have his work cut out for him." It was not an auspicious beginning. The days that followed were a blur of rituals and restrictions. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded silence, humility, obedience. She tested all three like locks on a door. At matins, she sang louder than allowed. At meals, she slipped extra bread to the lay sisters who worked in the kitchens. At confession, she told the priest she had sinned by thinking too clearly. He told her clarity was the devil's temptation. She told him ignorance was worse. He stopped hearing her confessions after that. By her 2nd year, she had learned the convent's rhythms: prayer, work, prayer, sleep. She also learned its secrets. The abbess accepted bribes from noble families to overlook broken vows. The chaplain drank more sacramental wine than he blessed. The infirmarian brewed potions for ladies in delicate circumstances, who arrived discreetly and left before dawn. Hypocrisy thrived under holy light. It made her laugh. Quietly, dangerously. One evening, while helping in the garden, she found a small bird caught in a net meant for pests. Its wing was torn. She freed it, bandaged it with a strip of her veil, and hid it in her cell. Every night, she whispered prayers to it, half mockery, half compassion. When it finally healed, she opened the window and let it fly. The next morning, she was punished for carelessness with property. She smiled through the beating. "If obedience is holiness," she murmured, "then the saints must be very dull. Thence the sender is forthing, and every will mand, and be nader." Mainstream historians agree that convents like St. Genevieve often served as repositories for unwanted daughters of nobility. But less discussed is how many of those women found quiet power within the walls. They managed estates, wrote treatises, and conducted correspondence with kings. Some even advised popes. It was, paradoxically, one of the few paths through which a medieval woman could wield influence provided she masked it as devotion. Our unruly nun never mastered the mask. She kept a hidden journal, written in a mixture of Latin and the vernacular French of her region. Only fragments survive, quoted by later chroniclers. In one she wrote, "I do not wish to escape the convent, only to escape stupidity." In another, "The soul that laughs is nearer to heaven than the one that trembles. It has wanting till to trows and wanting friend." Historians still argue whether these lines were genuine or invented by later satirists, but their tone feels too alive to be fiction. The abbess began to see her not merely as insolent, but dangerous. Disobedience was contagious. A single spark of laughter could unravel years of control. So she devised a plan to break her spirit gently, through penance and isolation. The girl was moved to a cold cell at the far end of the dormitory, ordered to fast twice as often, and forbidden to speak except in prayer. Silence became her companion, but never her master. She began to write with the charcoal from her brazier on scraps of cloth. When she ran out of cloth, she carved letters into the wooden floor with a hairpin. Words became her rebellion. She wrote about the seasons changing outside, about the scent of herbs from the infirmary garden, about the hollow sound of footsteps in an empty corridor. And in those writings, a strange serenity emerged, an understanding that freedom, if denied outwardly, could still thrive within. Then, one night, she dreamed, or perhaps imagined, that she stood before Christ himself. Not radiant, not distant, but weary and amused. "Why do you fight so hard?" he asked her. "Because everyone here lies," she said. "And you?" "I only lie when I pray." He laughed. "Then at least your lies are honest." She woke smiling. A record from 1,326 mentions a certain novice found, laughing in her sleep and claiming visions. The abbess declared it heresy of pride. Yet, quietly, the convent's younger sisters began to admire her. They slipped her bread, shared stories, asked her questions about the world beyond the walls. She became a paradox, punished as a sinner, loved as a saint of defiance. And here's the thing, when the human heart encounters both oppression and admiration, it grows unpredictable. One evening during Vespers, while the abbess intoned a psalm about humility, our nun began to sing harmony beneath it. Soft, lilting, undeniably beautiful. The other voices faltered, then joined her. For one brief moment, the entire chapel shimmered with unpermitted grace. Afterward, the abbess was furious. "Music," she declared, "is not meant to seduce the soul." Our nun bowed. "Then why does God listen?" Her punishment was silence again, but it didn't matter. The melody had escaped her lips and entered legend. A quirky discovery. Centuries later, in the archives of Avignon, musicologists found a fragment of polyphonic chant labeled Cantus Sororis, Song of the Sister. The notation suggests a voice leading others in counterpoint, unusual for its time. No composer is credited. Some believe it to be hers. It's easy, standing in that dusty archive, to imagine her voice still echoing across time. A single woman daring to sing differently in a world built on unison. Her father died before she could ever see him again. His estate passed to her brother, who sent a token donation to the convent for the soul of my difficult sister. The abbess accepted it grimly. Perhaps she hoped it might buy divine patience. But the girl, now a woman, was only growing stronger. Isolation had sharpened her wit, not dulled it. When finally allowed to rejoin the community, she seemed serene, almost obedient. She spoke softly, smiled when spoken to, and attended every service. The abbess relaxed. But beneath the calm, something coiled a storm rehearsing itself. One afternoon, a group of visiting knights arrived with relics to display. Among them was a fragment of bone said to belong to Saint Ursula. The abbess paraded it through the cloister with pomp. When the knights asked if the sisters wished to offer prayers, our nun stepped forward and asked, "And what proof do we have that this bone belonged to Ursula and not her horse?" The silence that followed could have shattered glass. The abbess fainted. The knights crossed themselves. The chaplain sputtered Latin curses. Later, under interrogation, she said, "If faith needs bones to stand, perhaps it has forgotten its spine." That quote, preserved in a 15th century satire, may or may not be authentic, but it sounds exactly like her. Historians still disagree whether her rebellion was personal pride or proto-feminist awakening. Some paint her as wickedly insolent, others as tragically ahead of her time. But perhaps both can be true. Perhaps she was simply alive in a system that preferred women not to be. As you watch her walking again through the convent courtyard, you sense that defiance hasn't hardened her, it's refined her. The mud-smeared girl has become a woman whose gaze could pierce steel. She still doesn't obey, but now she disobeys with purpose. She looks up at the sky, where clouds gather like ink, waiting for words. Somewhere beyond those walls, history is waiting for her, sharpening its quill. And you, standing in the shadows, can already feel the tremor of what's coming next, the breaking point, the scandal, the laughter that will echo through centuries. The girl who would not obey has only just begun. The morning she was to take her vows, dawn broke red and uncertain, as if the sky itself hesitated to bless the day. You can almost smell the dampness of that spring air, the mingled scent of incense and new grass, the faint metallic tang of dread. Bells rang from the convent tower, solemn and heavy, announcing not a wedding but its shadow, a ceremony of surrender. The courtyard filled with nobles and clerics, all dressed as though for triumph. Her family stood near the front, their faces stiff with propriety. Her mother's hands twisted a rosary, her father's eyes fixed somewhere beyond her, perhaps on the ledger of debts now balanced by her sacrifice. It was a strange kind of love, calculated, bloodless, and irreversible. She wore white, of course, but the fabric wasn't silk. It was coarse wool, unadorned, heavy enough to pull at her shoulders. Beneath the veil, her lips trembled not with tears, but with words she dared not speak. You can almost hear her heartbeat beneath the choir's chant. The abbess recited the familiar Latin, Accipe velum in sacrum, ut sis sancta sponsa Christi. Receive the sacred veil, that you may be the bride of Christ. The novice's hands were supposed to tremble in holy fear. Hers clenched around the fabric as if strangling it. When she lowered her head, the veil fell over her like snow over a flame. To those watching, she looked serene. But inside, she was screaming. When the choir's song ended, she rose, kissed the altar, and joined the sisters. There were no tears, no smiles, only a silence thick enough to drown in. That night, when she returned to her narrow cell, she pressed her palms against the stone wall and whispered, "If this is God's house, then he has a cruel sense of humor." A candle flickered on her desk. Beside it lay her discarded ribbon, the last remnant of her girlhood. She didn't cry. She couldn't afford the luxury. Historians still argue whether she had a lover before entering the convent. Some records hint at an improper attachment to a knight sworn to her father's service, a man named Etienne. Others insist she invented the romance as part of her later legends, a metaphor for lost freedom rather than lost love. But in one obscure parish ledger, there's an entry. Confessed a lady of noble birth who wept for a knight slain near Béziers. Name withheld by request. The dates match. Imagine it. Two young people meeting under a willow by the river, speaking in whispers too small for the world to notice. He swears he'll find a way to marry her. She laughs, because she already knows he won't. Their hands touch only once long enough for both to remember. Months later, word comes that Etienne fell in battle. She receives the news not from her family but from a passing squire who mistakes her for a servant. She listens without flinching, then walks straight to the chapel and kneels before the crucifix. "You take everything," she murmurs, "and call it devotion." That night, she volunteers to scrub the chapel floors. No one understands why. As the others sleep, she scours the marble until her fingers bleed. Until the reflection of the candles blurs in tears she pretends are sweat. It's easy to romanticize rebellion, but grief has its own quiet discipline. The next morning, she smiles when spoken to, eats her bread without complaint, and sings the psalms in perfect pitch. Only the abbess notices the difference in her tone, a new, unnerving calm, as if resignation itself has teeth. Mainstream historians note that many forced vocations in medieval Europe were justified by spiritual visions or family piety. In truth, it was economics. Convents were convenient vaults for daughters. Yet, paradoxically, these same prisons offered education, literacy, and moments of independence unthinkable for married women. For some, the veil became a disguise for freedom. For her, it was a gag. She soon learned the convent's economy of hypocrisy. Wealthy families sent generous donations in exchange for lenient discipline. The abbess hosted bishops with suspiciously fine wine and better cheese. The poor sisters were reminded to offer their hunger to Christ. When our nun questioned this imbalance, the abbess warned her. Pride speaks loudly. Holiness whispers. She replied, "Then holiness must have poor hearing." Punishment followed swiftly. 3 days of fasting and prayer, forbidden to speak even to God. You imagine her in her cell, the thin light slicing across her face, hunger gnawing but not devouring. On the second night, she sneaks a piece of bread from the window ledge, left by someone, perhaps a sympathizer, perhaps a silent admirer. She doesn't eat it immediately. Instead, she holds it up, whispers, "Body of rebellion," and takes a single bite. It's a small act, but small acts ignite revolutions. A quirky tidbit from convent records mentions a mysterious incident. One sister was discovered distributing bread to the crows. When rebuked, she said she fed those who would not betray her. The abbess noted, "Behavior inclines toward madness," but madness, in medieval chronicles, often meant simply inconvenient brilliance. That spring, the convent hosted visiting friars from a nearby monastery, Dominicans, trained in logic and sermon craft. During supper, one of them delivered a lecture on humility, insisting that women are vessels of obedience, as Eve was the vessel of error. The sisters nodded dutifully, all except one. She raised her hand. "If Eve's curiosity doomed us, then your curiosity to explain her seems dangerous too." The refectory fell silent. A spoon clattered. The friar's face flushed crimson. "You dare mock holy doctrine?" he barked. "I dare repeat it more honestly," she said. Later, he accused her of heresy. The abbess smoothed things over barely, but the damage was done. Her name circulated beyond the convent walls, whispered by clerics as the difficult sister. In the church's lexicon, difficult was the first step toward damned. Found stage, die, you'd think she'd be cautious after that. But defiance, once tasted, is addictive. She began writing again, small notes, prayers turned sideways, hidden beneath altar cloths or in the pages of psalters. One read, "If I am wed to Christ, then may he forgive me for not loving him as he deserves. B comes ask Crease. Another, faith is not a chain to wear gracefully. It is a knife to cut through lies. Historians still debate whether these writings were truly hers or later fabrications by reformist thinkers, but linguistic analysis of surviving fragments, spelling patterns, syntax suggests a single author with education far beyond the norm for a 14th century nun. Her defiance attracted attention not only from superiors but from peers. Some admired her courage, others feared contagion. A few envied her eloquence. One, a timid novice named Isabel, began copying her words into her own prayer book. When the abbess found it, Isabel was whipped, and our nun was condemned to isolation again. This time, it was different. Her cell was stripped bare. No candle, no ink, no quill. But she found ways to write, nonetheless, scratching words into the plaster with a piece of broken tile, carving faint letters that caught the moonlight when the clouds passed. Centuries later, during a renovation, workers found those markings. Fragments of sentences, almost eroded. One still legible phrase read, "Love is not obedience." The abbess, perhaps fearing scandal, ordered the wall plastered over. She couldn't have known she was preserving the message for the future instead of erasing it. Meanwhile, her health began to decline. Long fasts, damp chambers, sleepless nights, they wore her thin. Yet her spirit only sharpened. She began to laugh more often, a sound that unsettled even the bravest sisters. It wasn't hysteria. It was freedom, sneaking through cracks. On feast days, when the convent choir sang praises, her voice soared a little higher, richer, as if daring heaven to strike her down. It never did. Then came the incident that would define her forever. One night, a fire broke out in the convent kitchens. The sisters panicked. Smoke choked the hallways, flames licked the beams. While others fled to the chapel, she ran in the opposite direction to the cellar, where the wine barrels were stored. Witnesses later said she emerged carrying a single relic box from the altar's treasury, soot streaking her face like war paint. She set it outside the gate and collapsed. When asked why she'd risked her life for the relics, she answered, "Because they'd blame me if they burned. That's the kind of humor you can't teach." The relics survived. The kitchen did not. The abbess, grateful yet furious, punished her for reckless conduct unbecoming of a bride of Christ. She spent 2 weeks confined, fasting again. But when the smoke cleared, the sisters began whispering that perhaps she had saved them all. Some claimed to see her walking through the flames untouched, her veil glowing white. Others swore they heard laughter soft, unafraid amid the fire's roar. Historians still argue whether this was miracle, myth, or metaphor. One contemporary chronicler described a nun preserved by faith from the fire, another dismissed it as feminine exaggeration. But you can almost feel the heat, see her defiant silhouette against the blaze, daring even God to object. Afterward, the bishop arrived to assess the damage and her. He interviewed her personally, expecting tears, repentance, obedience. Instead, she met his gaze and said, "You came for ashes, but I am not done burning." He left without blessing the convent. Her punishment escalated from discipline to documentation. The bishop's secretary wrote in the margins of his report, "One sister displays signs of spiritual pride, bordering on madness, yet her eloquence confounds correction." That line, "eloquence confounds correction," would follow her across history, like a reluctant compliment carved by her enemies. Months passed. Her health wavered, but her spirit did not. She began mentoring younger nuns, teaching them to read forbidden texts smuggled in by sympathetic priests, Boethius. Even a little Ovid. She called it spiritual cross-training. One novice asked, "Isn't this sin?" She smiled. Then, "Let us sin beautifully." A quirky anecdote from later folklore claims she taught a raven to mimic Latin phrases. Whenever the abbess passed, it croaked, "O sancta hypocrisis! O holy hypocrisy!" No proof survives, of course, but the story endures because it feels right. Eventually, the abbess appealed to higher authority. The bishop ordered her transferred to another convent for her soul's correction and the peace of this house. The letter survives, brittle and water-stained, ending with the ominous phrase, "If she continues to sow discord, let her be given to the inquisitors." She was escorted away at dawn. The sisters lined the hall, silent. Isabel, the timid novice, slipped a small wooden cross into her hand. She didn't look back. As the gates closed behind her, thunder rolled across the hills, though the sky was clear. Later that evening, one of the lay sisters claimed she saw her white veil drifting in the air above the garden wall, as if carried by wind or wings. It was the last time Saint Genevieve saw her. The records end abruptly there. But her legend only begins to widen, branching through time like cracks in stained glass. Scholars trace her next appearance to a convent near Toulouse, where an anonymous sister of foreign birth disrupted discipline by preaching that the soul belongs to none but itself. Another chronicle in Burgundy mentions a woman in a nun's habit leading peasants in psalms against corrupt clergy. Historians still debate whether these were truly her or disciples inspired by her defiance. But you, standing here in the echo of her footsteps, suspect otherwise, because some spirits don't vanish when the veil falls, they rise. You imagine her on that road between convents, walking barefoot through mud and dawn, the wind tearing at her cloak. She hums softly, not a hymn, but a song of her own making. Each step takes her further from obedience, closer to legend. And in the distance, a bell tolls again, perhaps for prayer, perhaps for warning. You can almost hear her laughter riding on the wind, daring the world to try again to silence her. You reach the next chapter of her journey, and it smells faintly of wax and deceit. The new convent stands on a lonely ridge outside Toulouse, where the stones look pious but the hearts inside are weary. The Sisters of Saint Bernard pride themselves on discipline. The abbess boasts that her house is a mirror of divine order, but you can tell the mirror is cracked the moment you step inside. The corridors echo with contradictions. The walls are plastered with verses about humility, yet the abbess's ring catches enough sunlight to blind a saint. The kitchens feed pilgrims watery stew, but the refectory's inner chamber hides wheels of cheese and bottles of imported wine for visiting clergy. When the bishop arrives, the choir sings angelic hymns. When he leaves, the same sisters complain that his sermons smell of sweat and self-regard. And there she is, our infamous nun, standing among them, neither impressed nor surprised. Her transfer was supposed to be punishment, a correctional relocation. Instead, it's a promotion of sorts. This convent has more secrets to uncover, more rules to break. On her first day, she kneels before the abbess, a woman named Mother Beatrix, whose face is the perfect fusion of sugar and venom. "Welcome, sister," Beatrix says. "Here, we value silence, prayer, and obedience." "And truth?" the new sister asks. "Truth," the abbess answers smoothly, "depends on who's listening. It's not exactly love, at first sight." She's assigned to the scriptorium, copying sermons. Her handwriting is elegant, her Latin too precise. But every now and then, a small rebellion slips in, a comma moved, a phrase twisted, a marginal note like a wink to the reader. Heaven prefers honest laughter to false repentance. She scribbles in the side of a treatise on sin. The novice who finds it stifles a giggle and nearly drops the quill. It's here you begin to notice the rhythm of the place. By day, it's prayer and work. By night, it's murmurs, footsteps, keys turning in doors that are supposed to stay locked. The convent might look holy from the road, but behind its walls, sanctity and sin coexist like reluctant roommates. Mainstream historians confirm that many late medieval convents, especially wealthy ones, functioned as semi-autonomous estates. They held land, collected rent, and entertained patrons. Abbesses could rival bishops in power, and power, as always, attracts temptation. A quirky record from a 14th century diocesan audit of female houses lists the convent of Saint Bernarde as possessing 2 vineyards, 3 cows, and 1 unregistered chest of Venetian spices. The word unregistered is telling. Spices were luxury imports, often taxed, sometimes smuggled. The Sisters of Saint Bernarde, it seems, were not above creative accounting. Our nun learns quickly. She observes without judgment, at least at first. She watches the abbess's favorite confessors arrive at twilight, their robes suspiciously fine for mendicant friars. She notices the novices assigned to assist them in prayer are always chosen from the prettiest and youngest. She notices how confessions last longer when the candles are low. She doesn't intervene. Not yet. She's clever enough to know that truth told too soon becomes heresy. Instead, she begins to cultivate her role as the quiet observer. Her voice softens, Her smile grows serene. The abbess mistakes restraint for repentance. That's the danger of hypocrisy, it projects itself onto others. Historians still debate whether she had allies among the sisters. Some claim she mentored a group of younger nuns known later as Les Cercles Silencieux, the silent circle, women who shared forbidden texts and coded prayers. Others think she worked alone, a solitary needle pricking the veil of deceit, but all agree she had a gift for seeing through piety's costume. One afternoon, while cleaning the chapel, she finds a hidden compartment beneath the altar. Inside, a silk purse filled with coins and a letter sealed with the bishop's crest. She doesn't open it, but she smiles. So even heaven keeps a ledger, she whispers. Later, during confession, she asks the chaplain if greed counts as sin when practiced by those who wear mitres. He stammers, unsure whether to condemn or compliment her insight. The abbess hears of it, of course. Word travels faster than prayer. You have a sharp tongue, Beatrix warns. It could damn you. Or free me, she replies, depending on who's listening. It's the same answer the abbess once gave her. The echo isn't lost on either of them. That night, thunder shakes the convent. Lightning flashes across the stained glass, turning saints into specters. She lies awake, listening to rain hammer the roof, and thinks about obedience. It's supposed to bring peace. Yet everywhere she looks, obedience breeds corruption. Silence breeds rot. The thought terrifies and thrills her. In the darkness, she begins to compose something part prayer, part poem. She writes by memory, no ink, just words murmured into the storm. O Lord, if thy house be pure, why does its wine taste of dust? If thy brides be faithful, why do they whisper in the dark? If obedience be holy, why does it smell of fear? She sleeps at last, smiling. A century later, fragments of a similar poem appear in a Franciscan collection of anonymous spiritual songs attributed to Sor Ignota, the unknown sister. Scholars still debate if it's hers, but the rhythm carries her signature defiance. As weeks turn into months, her reputation spreads through the convent like candles smoke, impossible to contain. Some sisters find her frightening, others find her magnetic. They start coming to her for advice, for stories, for perspective. She listens, never preaching, just guiding. It's dangerous charisma, the kind that turns penitents into thinkers. The abbess notices the shift. Suddenly, the confessional lines shorten, the prayers lose fervor, the obedience cracks. During chapter the daily meeting where faults are confessed, the abbess tries to reassert authority. Pride, she declares, is the devil's favorite door. Our nun bows slightly. Then perhaps humility should stop knocking. The laughter that follows is small but audible. It's enough. From that day forward, the abbess wages a quiet war. She reassigns the rebel to the kitchens, to the infirmary, to the fields, anywhere that might humble her. But she thrives everywhere she's sent. She learns herbal medicine, experiments with tonics, saves a child from fever. Even the abbess's gout improves under her care. And yet, Beatrix can't shake the feeling that her own authority is slipping. She begins to dream of the nun standing at the altar, smiling that knowing smile. A mainstream fact worth remembering. Convents were among the few medieval institutions where women practiced medicine. Many sisters were skilled healers, midwives, and herbalists. They preserved ancient knowledge in an era when universities excluded women. Some even treated nobles who paid handsomely for discretion. Our nun turns healing into subtle power. When she tends the abbess's swollen feet, she murmurs psalms that sound suspiciously like insults in disguise. When she brews potions, she labels them with names like Tears of Mary or Patience of Job. The sisters whisper that her hands carry both blessing and curse. One day, a merchant delivers barrels of new wine to the convent. The abbess insists it's for liturgical use. Our nun oversees the transfer, tasting a drop. Too fine for liturgy, she mutters. More like diplomacy. She makes a note of the merchant's crest, a black lion on gold. Weeks later, she spots the same crest on a ring worn by the visiting bishop. It doesn't take a miracle to connect the dots. Historians still argue over the authenticity of the St. Bernarde accounts a ledger discovered in the 19th century detailing generous gifts from the bishop's household to the convent. But within those pages, in the margins, appear faint Latin phrases written in a different hand. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who watches the watchman? It's the kind of rhetorical dagger she would wield perfectly. Soon after, the abbess falls ill. Too much wine, too little conscience, perhaps both. She takes to bed, leaving our nun to manage daily affairs. Order improves. The kitchens feed everyone equally. The choir sings again with heart. The silence feels lighter, but peace never lasts long, where power once ruled. When Beatrix recovers, she finds her convent humming with the spirit of a woman she cannot control. She calls a private council, accusing the nun of insubordination, pride, and unnatural influence. The chaplain nods dutifully. The younger sisters stare at their feet. Our nun stands calm. You wish to cleanse sin, she says softly. Start with the ledger under your mattress. The room freezes. The abbess goes pale. You dare. I dare nothing, she interrupts. I simply notice. Later that night, the abbess has her confined again. But it's too late. The rumor has spread beyond the convent walls, reaching ears that matter. A bishop summons her to account for heresy of speech. It won't be the last trial of her life, but it will be the first that makes her name echo through Europe. Before she leaves, she walks through the cloister garden one final time. The vines curl along the arches, thick with grapes. She plucks one, rolls it between her fingers, and whispers, "The fruit of hypocrisy is sweet until it ferments." A passing novice overhears. Centuries later, that line appears in a French proverb. Le fruit de l'hypocrisie fermente vite. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences, like miracles, are just history's jokes. Historians still debate whether she was formally charged or informally exiled. The diocesan records mention a sister expelled for insolent speech in 1351. Another chronicle from Languedoc describes a nun who revealed her abbess's corruption and vanished thereafter. Either way, she left behind a legacy of broken decorum and unbroken will. The convent of St. Bernard would later burn in a mysterious fire. Some said lightning struck the bell tower. Others whispered that divine justice had simply arrived late. In the ashes, archaeologists centuries later found melted goblets and a single bronze key, engraved with the letters S.B., St. Bernarda, or perhaps something else, Sister Benedetta. When you picture her walking away from that smoking ruin, cloak whipping in the wind, you can't help but wonder if she looked back. Probably not. She'd already learned that sanctuaries built on hypocrisy collapse under their own prayers. She disappears down the road, toward the low hills where vineyards shimmer in morning light. The world beyond the cloister is wide, perilous, alive. For the first time in years, her breath doesn't echo off stone walls, it mingles with open air. The church may call her sinner, history may call her myth, but as you watch her vanish into the dust, you realize what she truly was, a woman allergic to lies, and for that, even God might have envied her. Night settles over the world like a velvet shroud, stitched with stars and the low hum of chanting voices. You can almost feel the air grow cooler as the sun dips below the horizon, leaving behind the long, soft twilight of Vespers. The candles in the chapel flicker like small hearts, uncertain whether to burn or die. And amid that wavering light, the whispers begin. This isn't St. Bernarde anymore. It's another convent, a smaller, quieter one, tucked against a forest where owls trade, gossip, and the wind sighs through birch leaves like the breath of restless souls. It's a house meant for repentance, not comfort. They call it St. Armand, though even the locals can't remember which saint it honors. It's a place the church uses for wayward sisters, those who have spoken too boldly, laughed too freely, or written too cleverly for their own salvation. You imagine her arrival, the crunch of gravel beneath her sandals, the way every eye turns to stare. No fanfare now, no golden-ringed abbess to greet her. Just an old prioress with a limp and a key ring that rattles like a threat. The walls smell of mildew and forgotten prayers. A crucifix hangs askew above the door, as if even Christ grew weary of watching this corner of obedience. She unpacks what little she owns, a plain habit, a battered psalter, and a pouch of herbs she insists are for headaches, though everyone suspects she means to brew something stronger. That night, the sisters sing Vespers in a low, almost trembling unison. The melody is ancient, the rhythm steady, but beneath it there's something fragile like faith stretched thin. When the last amen fades, silence doesn't follow. It hesitates. Then, from the shadows, you hear it, a soft laugh, barely audible, yet sharp as a spark in the dark. She's already begun. Whispers ripple through the dormitory afterward. They talk about her, the newcomer who smiles too much, whose eyes gleam when the candles die. One novice swears she heard her humming a tavern tune while sweeping the cloister. Another claims she saw her slip a note into the chapel's offering box. None of them dare report it, not yet, because there's something magnetic about her. During the day, she works with quiet precision. She tends the sick, copies manuscripts, grinds herbs for salves. She's obedient enough to be tolerated, sharp enough to be feared. The prioress watches her like a cat watches a mouse that might, at any moment, turn into another cat. But after Vespers, after the prayers end and the bells fall silent, that's when the convent breathes differently. Doors creak. Footsteps pause. Candles gutter in hallways that should be dark, and somewhere, beneath the hum of the night, the whispers start again, half prayer, half gossip, all alive. A mainstream fact here: convent life after Compline, the final prayer, was supposed to be silent. The rule of Saint Benedict forbade talking after nightfall. But historians know that holy silence was often theoretical. In practice, whispers after Vespers were where the real community lived. Secrets were traded, grievances aired, laughter shared like contraband. And in this convent, the whispers soon take her shape. She tells stories. That's her sin and her gift. She begins with harmless ones, saints who outwitted devils, angels who disguised themselves as beggars. But then she adds details no one remembers from the Gospels, details that make the stories human, unsettling, almost too alive. She tells them about Saint Agnes, who refused to marry not because she loved Christ, but because she'd seen enough men to know better. About Saint Margaret, who wrestled a dragon and wondered afterward whether it was lonelier than the world that feared her. About Mary Magdalene, writing letters to the apostles, none of which were ever read aloud. The younger sisters hang on every word. Even the prioress's maid, creeping down the corridor, finds herself listening from behind a door. Then she laughs, soft, rich, dangerous, and says, "Every woman of faith must choose her prison, a man, a convent, or her own silence." This, take it, historians still argue whether that line was truly hers or added later by Enlightenment writers seeking an early feminist icon. But either way, it carries her rhythm. Bold, amused, precise. The next morning, the prioress senses something has shifted. The sisters move differently, less meekly, more awake. Their eyes are brighter, their chants fuller. It's not rebellion yet, but the spark has caught. So the prioress summons her. "You have unsettled the peace," she says. "Perhaps peace was already unsettled," comes the reply. The prioress frowns. "We do not question God's order. Then why does God make people who do?" There's a long silence. Finally, the prioress says, "You think yourself clever." She smiles. "I think myself awake. Punishment is inevitable. 3 days fasting, 3 nights kneeling before the crucifix." But she takes it calmly, even joyfully. When the prioress checks on her the second night, she finds her humming again, head tilted toward the statue as if confiding in it. "Do you hear her too?" she whispers to Christ. "They think you're quiet because you agree. I think you're quiet because you're tired." The prioress slams the door and leaves her in darkness. A quirky tidbit. Later generations of nuns at St. Armand believed that particular crucifix had heard blasphemy and thus could not perform miracles. It was eventually moved to the attic. Centuries later, it was rediscovered, and beneath the base, restorers found a small scrap of parchment wedged into the wood. The writing was faint, but the words read, "To speak truth is not blasphemy, only premature." Back in the story, she survives her penance with her humor intact. She tells the sisters afterward that fasting only sharpens the mind. "Perhaps," she says, "that's why men keep us hungry." The laughter that follows is stifled behind hands, but it spreads. You can hear it low, contagious, scandalous. And soon, laughter turns into courage. A young sister confides that one of the visiting friars has been asking her for special confession in private. Another admits she's pregnant, terrified, begging for help. Our nun listens, not shocked, just quietly furious. She takes charge with the efficiency of a commander. The pregnant novice is hidden in the infirmary. The friar quietly denounced to the bishop's rival. The convent's secrets rearranged like a chessboard. Historians still debate the truth of this episode, known as the Saint Armand affair. Official records mention only moral disturbances, corrected by visitation. but a 15th century letter by a neighboring abbot hints that a certain nun acted as confessor and judge in matters improper to her sex. Which, of course, sounds exactly like her. The friar fled town. The novice vanished soon after, presumably spirited away under her protection. A small mercy in a cruel system. That winter, food grows scarce. The convent stores are nearly empty, and the prioress blames divine displeasure. But she, the rebel, has other theories. She discovers the steward selling grain to the village at inflated prices. One evening, she follows him and catches him red-handed. When she confronts him, he sneers. The abbess takes her share. She can have mine, she says, when she earns it. The next morning, the steward is gone. So is the grain. But somehow, miraculously, the storerooms are full again. No one asks questions. The prioress calls it providence. The sisters call it her doing. Soon the villagers begin leaving small gifts at the convent gate. Apples, bread, candles. They whisper about the laughing nun who helps the poor and mocks the proud. Her name becomes both prayer and rumor. A mainstream record from diocesan archives confirms that during a famine in 1352, a convent near Toulouse distributed bread without authorization. The bishop condemned it as disorderly charity. It's likely her doing, though the document doesn't say. Whispers after Vespers take on new shapes. They're no longer only stories, they're plans. Hidden alliances. The sisters begin to talk about justice, not as an idea, but as something they might actually practice. One night, she gathers them in the refectory. Candles flicker. The windows rattle in the wind. If the church will not feed the hungry, she says softly, then it's our turn to become the miracle. The novices nod. Even the prioress's loyal maid bows her head. That week, the convent sells its surplus linen and uses the money to buy bread for the village. The prioress, of course, is horrified. "You've disgraced this house," she cries. "No," says the nun. "We've reminded it why it exists." The prioress reports her to the bishop. Again. But when his envoys arrive, the villagers block the road. They bring loaves of bread, not weapons. "She saved our children," they say. "Touch her, and we will pray louder than your bells." The envoys retreat. The prioress resigns soon after, citing ill health. Historians still argue whether this uprising actually happened or was later embroidered by storytellers. Some call it folklore, others a proto-Reformation myth. Yet letters from nearby monasteries reference a contagious disobedience among the Sisters of Saint Armand. Contagious disobedience, that phrase alone ensures her immortality. In time, Saint Armand becomes known less for penance and more for laughter. Visitors describe hearing singing after Vespers, not of the liturgy, but of joy. The bishop eventually replaces the prioress with someone pliant, someone willing to keep the peace rather than enforce it. But she, our nun, doesn't stay. Peace bores her. She leaves one autumn evening, walking down the forest path with a sack over her shoulder and a smile on her lips. A local legend claims that, as she passed through the gate, the bells began ringing on their own. No one was pulling the ropes. The sound echoed through the valley like applause. Was it true? Historians still debate it. Maybe wind, maybe coincidence. But if you listen closely even now, if you stand by the ruins of Saint Armand at dusk, you might hear the faint ring of metal on air, and, just beneath it, a trace of laughter. She vanishes once more into the world beyond the walls. Some say she went north, others say east. Some claim she founded a group of wandering sisters, healers and storytellers, who moved from village to village. A papal edict from 1355 warns against unauthorized women preaching mercy in marketplaces. If that isn't her, then history's sense of irony deserves its own sainthood. And so, the whispers don't die. They change languages, accents, borders, but they all carry the same refrain. A woman who laughed where others prayed, who fed where others feared, who told stories that sounded suspiciously like truth. You can almost see her now, walking beneath the stars, her veil pulled low, her eyes glinting with mischief and resolve. Behind her, the convent sleeps uneasily, and the forest breathes like a living thing. She hums a tune, not a hymn this time, but a song born from defiance and tenderness both. It winds through the trees, soft but unbreakable. The owls answer, the night listens, and somewhere, far beyond the walls, the world begins to stir. Because once laughter finds its way into faith, no amount of silence can banish it. The first thing you notice is the smell. A convent always has its scents: beeswax, candle smoke, damp stone, but here, under the floorboards of St. Armand's ruins, another aroma reigns, the sweet, sharp perfume of wine. Fermented prayer, bottled rebellion. It seeps from barrels old enough to remember every sin ever whispered above them. You descend with her now, step by step, into the cool darkness. A torch sputters, throwing trembling light across rows of casks that line the cellar walls like sleeping soldiers. Each is marked with a small cross and a date, but several have been scratched out, replaced by nonsense sigils, half blessing, half blasphemy. This is where the story takes its next turn, because every convent has a secret heart, and here, it beats beneath the altar. She discovers it by accident, or at least, that's what she tells the sisters. One afternoon, while fetching candles, she notices a draft near the chapel wall. The floor tiles shift under her step, hollow. Beneath them, a trapdoor, cleverly disguised. She opens it to find a staircase winding down into shadow. And there, waiting like an unrepentant miracle, lies the wine cellar. Technically, such a space shouldn't exist. Monastic rules allowed a small amount of wine for mass and medicine. But this was a vineyard's fortune. Rows upon rows of barrels, gleaming with faint condensation. Dust motes dance like incense smoke around her. It's a treasure of temptation. And she laughs aloud, because of course holiness hides its best wine underground. That night, she returns with a single candle and a cup. She tastes. It's not just wine, it's astonishing. Rich, dark, humming with spices, she whispers, "For the glory of God," and takes another sip. And that's how the confessions begin. The following weeks bring rumors of missing communion wine. The sisters murmur about evaporation and divine thirst, but no one dares investigate. Only she knows the truth, and she's careful to share it wisely. Because the cellar isn't merely a place of indulgence. It becomes, under her cunning, a sanctuary of honesty. You see, by this time, the convent has new leadership. The prioress, anxious, pious, too kind for her own good, wants unity among the sisters. But unity, as always, comes at the cost of truth. Whispers fester, confessions grow stale, and so our nun decides to help in her own way. She begins inviting a few sisters, just a handful, to join her in the cellar after dark. Not for sin, she insists, for clarity. They come, trembling, clutching rosaries. She pours the wine and blesses it not mockingly, but with quiet reverence. "The blood of Christ," she murmurs, and the courage to speak plainly. The candlelight turns their faces golden. The air smells of fruit and fire. They drink, and slowly, words spill like the wine itself, honest, unfiltered. One admits she doubts the Virgin ever answered her prayers. Another confesses she misses the sound of her mother's voice more than she loves the sound of the Psalms. A third says she sometimes dreams of the sea, even though she's never seen it. Our nun listens, nods, never judges. Truth, she tells them, isn't a sin. It's just poorly marketed. They scent of the minor. They laugh, and the laughter feels holy. Historians still argue whether this cellar circle ever truly existed, but in a surviving letter, unsigned, undated, found among confiscated convent correspondence, one line reads, "We spoke freely, as women do when God forgets to watch." Thank you for watching too. A quirky tidbit. In the same region, a century later, local folklore celebrated a saint of the cup, a mysterious woman who taught nuns to drink without shame. Scholars think it refers to her, transmuted by legend into something half sacred, half scandalous. But here, in this moment, it's simple. The cellar becomes a confessional for those who crave honesty more than absolution. Each week, new sisters join. They bring bread, figs, sometimes stolen cheese. Someone finds a lute, and soon songs fill the dark, half psalm, half love ballad. They sing quietly, their voices blending like the harmonies of forgotten angels. And she, the instigator, sits at the center, not as leader but as listener. She understands something dangerous, that faith can survive laughter, but not silence. One night, during Lent, a young novice asks her, "If God disapproves, why doesn't he stop us?" She smiles. Maybe he's enjoying the music. That same week, the bishop's inspector arrives. You can almost hear the panic ripple through the convent. The prioress goes pale. The cellar door is sealed. The sisters hide their bottles and hearts alike. The inspector, a severe man with a quill sharper than his faith, interrogates each nun in turn. He smells sin the way dogs smell meat. When it's her turn, she's ready. He demands to know whether the rumors of nocturnal feasting are true. She tilts her head. If by feasting you mean fellowship, yes. If by sin you mean joy, also yes. He frowns. And the wine? She gestures toward the crucifix. Christ's first miracle was hospitality. Life not. He blinks, unsure if she's mocking him. She isn't well, not entirely. The report he sends to the bishop still survives, brittle but legible. It reads, "One sister displays theological wit of a troubling kind. Her piety is excessive in imagination. Recommend confinement." This all in Bacton. Excessive in imagination. That's how institutions describe those who think too deeply. They confiscate the wine, or so they think. She and her circle, of course, have hidden several barrels behind false walls. The cellar remains alive, though smaller, humbler. Its gatherings grow quieter, more secret. And something begins to change in her. The wine confessions shift from amusement to revelation. She listens differently now, not just for words, but for wounds. She begins keeping small notes, lists of what each woman fears, hopes, dreams, not for manipulation, but for memory. She's building a secret gospel of her own, the gospel according to the forgotten. Mainstream historians remind us that in the 14th century, women's spiritual movements like the Beguines were often suppressed for precisely this reason. They dared to find God not in ritual, but in direct experience, especially communal experience. Her cellar circle mirrors that impulse, faith turned inward, then shared outward. But power never ignores such warmth. Months later, a second inspection arrives, this time less polite. The bishop's men search every room. They find traces, empty bottles, wax drippings, a scrap of parchment that reads simply, "Better drunk on truth than sober on fear." That one line travels far. Within years, preachers are condemning it from pulpits as heresy. Pamphlets circulate warning of a woman devil who teaches laughter as prayer. The convent disbands her circle. The sisters are separated, reassigned. She is summoned again, this time not by the bishop, but by Rome itself. Historians still argue whether the papal summons was genuine or forged by local authorities. What's certain is that she left under guard, traveling north with 2 friars who refused to speak her name. On the road, one of them breaks his silence. "Why do you laugh?" he asks as they ride. "Because you still think God needs defending," she says. He flinches. "You think yourself equal to the saints?" She shakes her head. "No, just equal to men." That sentence alone would be enough to doom her. They stop one night at an inn. The friars lock her door. At dawn, the room is empty. The latch is untouched. No sign of struggle, just the faint scent of wine in the air. A letter appears weeks later, delivered anonymously to Saint Armand's remaining sisters. In it, she writes, "Do not mourn. The cup is not broken, only passed along. Wherever women laugh in truth, I will be among them." That letter, whether real or apocryphal, marks the end of her recorded trail for nearly a decade. Yet the traces of her linger in strange places. Parish priests complain of female heretics with silver cups preaching comfort to the poor. A wandering song spreads through Occitania about a nun who turned water into wine and vanished before dawn. Even merchants begin carving small symbols on their tavern doors. A crescent cup, with 3 drops, said to ensure honest dealings and laughter unpunished. In one of the Olivin and Incree, something with the proplasty. A quirky aside, in a remote French village today, there's a spring called Fontaine de la Surrieuse, the fountain of the laughing sister. Locals still leave small wine bottles there during harvest festivals. They say the water tastes faintly sweet, like something blessed long ago. It's tempting to dismiss all this as folklore. Historians, cautious as always, file it under unverified traditions. But stories like wine ferment truth in ways data cannot. And you can almost see her again, somewhere far from the cloister, standing beneath a grove of olive trees, her habit replaced by a simple cloak. Around her, villagers sit on the grass, cups in hand, listening as she tells stories that make them laugh. Then think, then laugh again. The moonlight spills like mercy across their faces. She raises her cup and toasts them. To saints who drink, and sinners who share. They drink. The world feels less cruel for a while. Back in Rome, the Inquisition begins whispering about a female apostate preaching sacrilegious equality. They issue edicts, search orders, condemnations. But she never appears again in any official record. It's as if the earth itself swallows her into legend. Perhaps she changes her name. Perhaps she flees to Italy or Spain. Perhaps she dies quietly in a village where no one knows she once challenged the church. But somehow, somewhere, you feel she's still alive, because ideas like hers never stay buried. They rise, effervescent, every time someone dares to mix faith with laughter. The wine cellar of Saint Armand eventually collapses. Centuries later, during restoration work, archaeologists find a single goblet buried beneath the rubble. It's simple pewter, engraved with one phrase in faint Latin: Vinum veritas, amor libertas. Wine is truth, love is freedom. It sits now in a small museum, labeled Anonymous Artifact, 14th century. But if you stand close enough, if you tilt your head just right, you might almost hear faint laughter echoing from the metal. You realize it's not just hers, it's the laughter of every woman who's ever confessed without fear. Every soul who's ever refused to sip obedience when joy was available. Because once upon a time, in a convent built on silence, one nun uncorked the oldest miracle of all: honesty. And like good wine, it still breathes. The day he arrived, the whole convent held its breath. You can almost feel the air tighten, how even the wind outside seemed to hush, as though reluctant to disturb the fragile decorum hanging over the cloister. A bishop was coming. That word alone could turn laughter to silence and transform mischief into guilt, at least for most souls. For her, it only made the day more interesting. It had been months since the infamous wine cellar confessions, and though her gatherings had long since dissolved, their echo lingered. The church wanted reassurance that Saint Armand's scandalous laughter was dead and buried. So they sent a man to verify it, a man draped in velvet righteousness, with rings that sparkled when he pointed in judgment. Bishop Guillaume de Rochefort, the Holy See's local representative, was known for his austerity and appetite in equal measure. He condemned luxury from the pulpit and indulged it at the table. He arrived in a procession of clerics and servants, bringing with him a traveling confessor, a scribe, and 3 carts of supplies, one filled entirely with wine. The irony was lost on no one. The sisters rushed to prepare. Floors were scrubbed, sheets laundered, banners hung. The prioress fluttered like a nervous hen, muttering psalms under her breath. "We must prove ourselves," she said. "We must show him this house is restored to grace." And then there was her standing in the courtyard, watching it all unfold with a small, knowing smile. "If grace requires rehearsing," she murmured. "Perhaps it's already gone." The prioress glared but said nothing. When the bishop's entourage entered, the sisters knelt. His Eminence blessed them with a sign of the cross that felt more like ownership than sanctity. "Rise, daughters," he said, "and may your obedience be your offering." Our nun rose last, her gaze steady. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers, and something flickered, not recognition. Not yet, but the sharp awareness of 2 predators, sniffing the same air. During his inspection, the bishop praised the cleanliness of the chapel, the order of the cells, the devotion of the sisters. "Truly," he said, "this house has been reclaimed for God." Then he paused beside her as she tended the herb garden. "And you," he said softly, "I am told you were once less obedient." "Then you've been misinformed," she replied without looking up. "I was never obedient at all." He chuckled. "I see repentance has not dulled your wit, and authority has not sharpened your humility." The scribe beside him dropped his pen. That evening, the bishop announced he would dine with the sisters, a rare honor meant to celebrate their restored virtue. The prioress panicked. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Bread was baked, stew simmered, candles replaced. But our nun, of course, volunteered to oversee the wine. "After all," she said, "I've some experience in that department." The prioress nearly fainted. At sunset, the refectory gleamed. The bishop sat at the high table, surrounded by attendants and wary nuns. The air smelled of roasted onions and sanctimony. Grace was said, platitudes exchanged. Everything proceeded perfectly until the second course, when the bishop lifted his cup, tasted the wine, and stopped mid-sip. "This," he said, "is remarkable. Where is it from?" The prioress paled. Before she could answer, the nun stepped forward. "From the same vineyard that supplied your cellars last winter, my lord. The mark on the barrel was yours." For a moment, no one breathed. Then laughter. Soft, incredulous laughter. From him. "Ah," he said, "so, the rumors are true. You have a sharp tongue indeed." And then one and ever redness out, and with friends of no to of hape. "I prefer sharpness to dull devotion," she said, eyes bright. "It cuts cleaner." He smiled, not offended, amused. That was his mistake. Historians still debate the nature of their interaction that night. Some claim it was flirtation, others, theological sparring. But eyewitness accounts, rare, fragile things, suggest that something electric passed between them, something that unsettled both faith and flesh. He asked her to sit beside him. "Tell me," he said, "why do you remain in the habit if your heart clearly chafes at it?" She shrugged. "Because God has terrible fashion sense. I stay to offer improvement." The scribe choked on his bread. The bishop laughed again, genuine this time. "You are dangerous," he said. "I've been told," she replied, raising her cup, "usually by men, livering, and any rated to final self, cancer." Mainstream historians record that bishops in 14th century France often visited convents to inspect discipline, but such visits were also social affairs, opportunities for networking, patronage, and subtle negotiations. Many bishops viewed convents as extensions of their power. Some treated them as personal fiefs. Against that backdrop, her audacity becomes clearer. She wasn't just mocking a man, but the entire architecture of control he embodied. As the meal continued, the conversation deepened. The sisters watched in stunned silence as she and the bishop debated scripture like equals. She quoted the Gospels in Latin, correcting his translation with the casual precision of someone who actually reads. He countered with Augustine. She parried with Julian of Norwich. "You speak as if God is your accomplice," he said at last. "Only when he's in the mood," she replied. That line would later be copied into at least 3 satirical pamphlets condemning the insolent sister who made bishops blush. No. Fangs. When dessert came, honeyed figs and fresh bread, he poured wine for her himself. "One more toast," he said. "To forgiveness." She clinked her cup against his. "To memory. It lasts longer." And for a heartbeat, the world held still. A quirky tidbit. One 17th century manuscript in the archives of Carcassonne contains a miniature depicting a bishop dining with a nun. The caption reads, "The Supper of Truth and Temptation." Scholars aren't certain, but the scene bears uncanny resemblance to descriptions of this event. After dinner, the bishop requested a private audience for confession. The prioress, flustered but obedient, allowed it. They met in the chapel, candlelight dancing across the walls. He spoke first. "Do you know, sister, the stories they tell about you?" "Foris. No. I know them better than anyone," she said. "I wrote most of them." He smiled. "Then confess. Tell me what drives you. Pride, doubt, desire?" She met his gaze. "Curiosity." He leaned closer. "And what do you hope to find?" "An honest man," she said. "You'll do for now." The speeder no say. What passed between them then is lost to history. Some accounts hint at temptation resisted. Others, temptation embraced. A letter from the bishop's own secretary, later discovered among his effects, describes his superior as troubled for weeks after his visit to Saint Armand, plagued by dreams of a woman who spoke like scripture rewritten. "When I'll take about it." The third-eyed. What we do know. By the following month, the bishop issued an edict forbidding further private conversations between clergy and female religious without witness. The rule, copied widely, became known as Guillaume's Clause. Ironically, it immortalized the very scandal it sought to suppress. Historians still argue whether she seduced him, shamed him, or simply outwitted him. The Church's version insists she bewitched him through heretical rhetoric. Her defenders claim she exposed hypocrisy so deftly that his own conscience revolted. But perhaps both are true, because power, once forced to see itself clearly, always trembles. In the weeks after his departure, life in the convent changed subtly. The prioress treated her with wary respect. The sisters whispered less in fear and more in awe, and she herself, though outwardly unchanged, seemed quieter, more inward. not broken, but refined, as though the encounter had tempered something within her. One evening, she climbed the bell tower at dusk. The view stretched endless, the hills, the forests, the faint line of the road the bishop had taken. She stood there long after the sun set, until the stars began to appear. Then, softly she said, "Forgive me not, Lord. I've grown fond of the ache. That's like one, and that no good of o'er fordus with not." A mainstream fact. Medieval mystics often described their encounters with divine longing in language that bordered on erotic. Scholars note how female mystics blurred the line between spiritual ecstasy and bodily sensation. Our nun, whether mystic or mocker, clearly understood that overlap and wielded it like poetry. In the months that followed, her influence spread again. The younger sisters began writing their own reflections, small scraps of prose that mixed prayer with confession. They left them in the chapel, unsigned. The prioress tried to stop it, but the tide was too strong. The act of speaking truth had become habit. A visiting friar found one of these writings and sent it to his abbot. Within weeks, copies circulated across the diocese. They were titled The Meditations of an Unknown Sister. The church denounced them as dangerous, but the people, especially women, loved them. One passage read, "Faith is not submission but pursuit. To chase God is to honor him more than those who claim to have caught him." And had another. Obedience without thought is the slowest form of suicide. Historians still debate whether she wrote the meditations herself or inspired them. The style matches her wit, the tone, her defiance. If not her hand, then certainly her spirit. The bishop, for his part, never returned to Saint Armand. But his sermons afterward grew strangely tender. He began preaching mercy over fear, understanding over punishment. Some say he kept a silver cup on his desk, engraved with a single word, Veritas. It's tempting to imagine her influence lingering in his thoughts like perfume, impossible to confess, impossible to forget. Years later, a chronicler wrote that a certain nun turned a bishop's dinner into a divine comedy, wherein truth wore a woman's face. That might sound exaggerated, but it captures the essence. For one night, across a table meant for power, she proved that even the church's mightiest men could be made to blush by honesty. And as you picture her that evening lifting her cup beneath candlelight, her laughter warm and unrepentant, you realize the brilliance of it. She didn't fight the church with swords or flames. She fought it with wit, with presence, with the simple audacity to speak as though she belonged in any room she entered. Because she did. When the bishop came to dinner, she didn't just survive his scrutiny, she converted it into legend. And though the church tried to erase her afterward, forbidding her writings, scattering her sisters, sealing her name behind edicts, they could never erase that moment. The moment a nun, bound by vows, unbound a man with truth. That night still lingers like a long swallow of forbidden wine, sweet, startling, impossible to forget. You can tell a secret by how softly it's written. Not in the bold letters of rebellion, but in the tiny spaces between them in the margins, where official eyes never look. The next part of her story is written there, in those slim white edges of parchment, in ink that has faded but never quite disappeared. It begins, as so many dangerous things do, with boredom. After the bishop's visit, the convent enters a strange calm. The church considers the scandal resolved, the sisters return to their prayers, and the prioress walks with relief that sounds almost like guilt. The world outside forgets, as it always does, but she, our defiant sister, cannot abide stillness. Days stretch long inside stone walls. Hours pass measured by bells, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Each one a reminder that time itself is captivity, ringing from above. She copies texts in the scriptorium to pass the monotony, homilies, psalters, sermons, words that all say the same thing in slightly different disguises. But soon, her pen begins to wander. At first, it's harmless flourishes, a curling vine twining around an illuminated letter, a small bird perched beside a psalm. Then come faint phrases in the margins, half-thoughts, unfinished prayers, jokes only she would understand. Then one day, between two verses of Canticle of Canticles, she writes, "He kisses me with the truth no priest dares preach." It's an unremarkable line, until you realize it's her own handwriting, and that she's writing it for someone. Historians still argue about the mysterious letters of the Laughing Nun. Fragments survive in monastery archives, snippets of poetry, philosophical musings, notes of confession or desire. None are signed, but the style is unmistakable, her quick wit, her play with faith, her sly tenderness. Some scholars say these letters were written to a fellow nun. Others insist they were addressed to the bishop himself. A few romantics whisper that they were written to God. But the truth, as always, sits somewhere in the middle of those possibilities, sipping wine and smiling. Because the letters are not declarations of love. They are conversations written for someone who could understand her, whoever that happened to be. You can almost picture her at the desk, candlelight haloing her hands, quill scratching softly as she leans close to the parchment. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and the convent sleeps. Inside, her mind dances with words. You speak of purity, one letter reads, but I have seen holiness in hunger, and divinity in laughter. Why must your God be so easily scandalized? Leslie press. And we ready big not, in bad be safe. Another. I am told love for the divine burns away the self. Yet when I think of you, I feel more alive, not less. If that is sin, then hell is kinder than heaven. A third, more playful. I dreamed you preached humility to a room full of mirrors. Rebrust. They have to describe. Quirky tidbit centuries later, during restoration of a ruined abbey near Albi. Workers discovered fragments of parchment used to bind the spine of a theology book. On one piece, faint but legible, were the words, "We are all scripture in draft form." Scholars traced the handwriting to the same regional scriptorium active during her lifetime. It seems her words, even when condemned, found ways to survive. But how did she send them? A lay brother named Pierre handled correspondence between convent and diocese. He was old, slow, and nearly blind, a poor guardian for secrets. When the prioress dictated her letters to him, she often left him alone with the ink drying. It was easy for her to slip her own folded notes among them, tucked inside the same wax seals. The recipient, whoever he or she was, must have known. The letters bear no greeting, no name, just the rhythm of conversation that suggests a writer who knows her words will be read and answered, even if only silently. You said God is silence, one letter reads. Then you should know he listens in me. Historians still debate whether the tone of these writings was mystical or romantic. But the question misses the point. In a world that denied women the right to think aloud, the act of writing at all was a kind of desire, a desire for witness, for understanding, for being seen. And she was, finally, seen. Because one morning, while cleaning the scriptorium, a novice found a page that had slipped from her desk. It bore no signature, only a line of Latin verse. Amor non peccat nisi absens est. Love does not sin unless it is absent. The novice, frightened, brought it to the prioress. The investigation began immediately. Her desk was searched, her papers seized. The prioress demanded to know the truth. "Did you write these blasphemies?" she asked. Our nun smiled faintly. "They're not blasphemies if they're beautiful." The prioress slammed a fist on the table. "Who is he?" "He?" she echoed. "I didn't say it was a he." That silence that followed was louder than any confession. She was confined again, this time under watch. No ink, no parchment, no quill. But words, like water, find cracks. She began carving them with a nail into the wall of her cell. Short, fierce phrases, prayers sharpened into poetry. When the bishop's envoy came to question her, he found her kneeling before the wall, tracing her finger over one line. If the soul cannot touch, what use is salvation? He left without speaking. The church's response was predictable. Her writings were declared heretical, her letters of improper affection confiscated and destroyed. She was threatened with excommunication. But even as she stood before her accusers, she remained unbroken. "Do you deny writing these?" the bishop asked. "I deny calling them sin," she replied. Her trial, if it can be called that, was brief. They chose mercy over martyrdom. She was transferred again to a remote convent in the Pyrenees, where winters froze speech itself, and only the wind dared argue. The logic was simple. Cold and isolation would cure passion. But isolation had never frightened her. It was her native country. There, among snow and silence, she found a strange kind of peace. The sisters spoke little, worked much. They wove wool, prayed by rote, and watched the seasons crawl. No one bothered her, no one even asked her name, and so she began writing again. This time, she used scraps of vellum from discarded manuscripts. She didn't hide her words anymore, she wove them directly into her work. When copying psalms, she slipped in extra lines, hidden within the Latin grammar like a code. For example, one surviving page of Psalm 23 reads, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, unless he withholds laughter." Another, "He restoreth my soul, and yet the soul he restoreth is no longer his to keep, and to sometimes solda." Historians call these glossed psalms, a kind of spiritual graffiti that reimagines the sacred through wit, but to her, it was simple honesty. Faith, she believed, should breathe, a mainstream fact. Women scribes in medieval convents often left marginalia drawings, personal notes, even jokes. One English manuscript features a nun doodling a cat chasing a mouse beside a sermon on temptation. The human spirit, it seems, always sneaks in between the lines. Our nun took that tendency to divine extremes. Her glosses spread quietly, copied by others who admired her boldness. A century later, anonymous female commentators would be accused of laughing theology, a term scholars now trace directly to her. But in her lifetime, danger still lurked. The local prior grew suspicious when pilgrims began asking about the laughing sister who writes miracles. He ordered her work destroyed and her person confined once more. She spent an entire winter locked in a cell so cold that ink froze in its pot. Yet when spring came, and the sisters cleaned her room, they found words scratched into the frost on the windowpane. "You cannot silence a smile. Have light hands servement." A quirky legend claims that same year, a snowstorm buried the convent for 7 days. When it melted, they found the walls covered in faint writing verses no one could quite read, as though the storm itself had carried her thoughts across the stone. Perhaps it's nonsense, or perhaps the sky finally decided to take dictation. Historians still argue about her final months there. Some claim she was freed by sympathetic sisters and fled again. Others believe she died peacefully in that cold cell, quill in hand, eyes open to the dawn. What's certain is that her letters, those quiet rebellions in ink, refused to die. They traveled through generations of women who copied them into their prayer books, hiding them under lines of scripture. They quoted her without naming her, knowing her words would be safer disguised as saints' wisdom. "To love is not to sin." One such line appears in a 16th century French devotional. "To fear love is to forget that God began as desire." Her name may have vanished, but her handwriting endured. And as you picture her now, bent over the desk, ink-stained fingers steady, eyes bright despite the cold, you realize this was her final triumph. She outwitted oblivion, not through fame, but through margins. Through the quiet persistence of words, written small enough to survive censorship. You can almost hear her voice again, whispering as the candle gutters. "Let them burn my pages. The flame only makes the margins shine." It's the kind of line that should have been lost. But of course, it wasn't. Because somewhere, right now, someone is reading her words and smiling just as you are. And that, she would say, is the closest thing to prayer worth keeping. You can almost see it, the flicker of candles reflected in polished brass, the restless shifting of robes, the rustle of parchment in a hall too large for mercy. It's not a courtroom exactly, not the kind you know from modern stories, but a refectory converted to judgment. The benches have been cleared, the crucifix draped in black cloth. On the table lies a single book of statutes, a silver cross, and beside them, the ink and quill that will record her fate. The year, they say, was 1358, though dates blur like smoke when politics meets piety. Somewhere in southern France, the church has decided it can no longer ignore her. The letters, the laughter, the whispered psalms that reek of free thought, these have spread too far. The Pope himself has demanded an inquiry, and so tonight she stands before a tribunal of abbots, friars, and one trembling prioress who cannot quite meet her eyes. She is thinner now, older perhaps, though not by much. Years in cloisters and exile have carved her sharp rather than soft. Her hair, streaked with gray, peeks out beneath her veil. Her hands, folded loosely before her, look steady. Her voice, when she speaks, carries the same melody as ever, calm, ironic, unrepentant. "You are accused," the presiding friar begins, "of blasphemy, heresy, and indecent mirth unbecoming of a bride of Christ. Mirth? She echoes, tilting her head. Since when was laughter indecent? The friar glares. Since it mocks the holy order. 8-1 silver. Then perhaps the holy order should stop behaving like a joke. The chamber erupts in scandalized whispers. Someone crosses himself. The scribe's quill hesitates mid-stroke, but she doesn't flinch. For all the theater of it, the trial has already been decided. It isn't justice they seek, it's submission. What they want is simple. A recantation, a written confession, a neat end to a messy legend. They've heard she's clever, but clever women are easy to silence when cornered, or so they think. The friar clears his throat. You have written things that challenge the authority of Holy Church. You have claimed laughter to be divine, that obedience is bondage, that women are equal to men before God. Only if he's as fair as you claim, she says. The abbess beside him snaps. Blasphemy. Thank you for watching. No, she says softly. Arithmetic. Mainstream historians confirm that inquisitorial trials against nuns were rare, but not unheard of. Most involved accusations of spiritual pride or improper visions, sins of thought rather than flesh. Punishments ranged from penance to imprisonment, though the church preferred quiet resolutions over spectacle. Yet some cases, like this one, refuse to stay quiet. They present their evidence, her glossed psalms, her letters, testimonies from frightened sisters. One friar recites from memory a line she supposedly wrote, "The soul belongs to none but itself." "Do you deny these words?" he asks. She considers, then shakes her head. "No, I only regret not writing more." The prioress gasps. The bishop overseeing the tribunal rubs his temple. "Sister," he says in a tone meant to sound gentle, "you once served God faithfully. Why throw away your salvation for pride?" She looks up at him, her gaze steady. "If salvation demands silence, I prefer damnation with a voice." Even the candlelight seems to pause. You might expect rage from her judges. But what you hear instead is something quieter fear, the kind that creeps in when power realizes its reflection doesn't look as holy as it imagined. They call witnesses. A nervous novice stammers about the secret gatherings, the songs, the wine. "She said," the girl whispers, "that God enjoys laughter more than fasting." The friar pounces. "Do you see? Heresy in its purest form." But she interrupts. "I said that joy nourishes better than hunger. You twist it into sin because it tastes of life." The scribe's quill scratches furiously. Another witness, a young nun from the Pyrenees, weeps as she speaks. She taught us to read scripture differently, to find ourselves in the stories." The friar slams his fist on the table. "You see, my lord bishop, pride, the root of all disobedience." The bishop sighs. "And yet she makes sense," he mutters, too quietly for the others to hear. Outside, thunder murmurs. The hall smells of wax and judgment. At last, they allow her to defend herself. She steps forward, her chains clinking faintly against the stone floor. The candles behind her flare, casting her shadow long across the wall, tall, confident, impossible to erase. "You call me heretic," she begins, "because I speak as though God were listening. But tell me, what else is prayer, if not conversation? You call my laughter blasphemy, yet you preach of heavenly joy. You accuse me of pride for daring to think, but it was thought that made us human. I have broken vows, yes, but not to God, only to men who mistook themselves for him." Her words fall like stones into still water. Historians still debate whether her speech was recorded accurately. The transcript that survives is fragmentary, damaged by time and censorship. But one passage, preserved in a margin note by the anonymous scribe, reads, "Her tone was neither mad nor humble. She spoke as if truth itself sat beside her. They question her for hours. She answers each charge with calm defiance, sometimes wit, sometimes compassion. When asked if she repents, she says, 'I repent only that I did not begin sooner.' When asked if she loves Christ, she replies, 'Enough to argue with him,' a quirky tidbit. Later legends claim that during her trial, the candles in the hall burned higher whenever she spoke and guttered when her accusers did. Some even say one candle refused to go out for 3 days after her departure. Skeptics call it myth, believers call it sign. But you can decide which feels more truthful. The verdict, of course, is guilty. Not of heresy, too dangerous a label, but of excessive spiritual independence. They declare her unfit for holy office and sentence her to perpetual confinement in a penitent's cell. As the judgment is read, she bows slightly, as though accepting an award. "I thank you," she says. "You have given me what every saint desires time to think." We canvass under of unwind, the word in one end. They escort her away by torchlight, down corridors that echo with muttered prayers. But she doesn't weep. She hums instead, the faint melody of one of her cellar songs, something lilting, irreverent, indestructible. In the cell they choose for her stone, narrow, a slit of a window. She finds an old candle stub and a piece of slate. No ink, no paper. But she doesn't need them. She begins to scratch words into the wall again, the same way she did years before. This time, she writes for no audience. They mistake obedience for virtue. They mistake silence for peace. But the soul speaks whether the mouth does or not. Days turn to weeks. The guards whisper that she never sleeps. That at night, light seeps from beneath her door, not candlelight, but something whiter, colder. The bishop visits once, hoping to extract a final confession. She greets him with a smile. "Do you hate me?" he asks. "No," she says. "You listened once. That's more than most." He sighs. "I tried to protect you. I never asked to be protected, only to be heard." He leaves without absolution. Mainstream records note her death a few months later, peacefully, after prolonged penance. But unofficial reports tell another story. A lay brother claimed that one morning her cell was found empty, the door still locked from inside. Only a few words remained etched on the wall. Truth travels faster than chains can hold it. No body, no trace. The church quietly closed the case, declaring her taken by God's will. But the sisters, who'd once known her, believed otherwise. Because soon after, strange things began to happen. A novice claimed she saw her figure kneeling in the chapel during Compline, eyes closed, mouth curved in a smile. Another swore she heard laughter echoing through the cloister when no one else was there. The prioress, terrified, ordered extra prayers, but secretly left bread and wine on the chapel steps, an offering, perhaps, or apology. The legend of her candlelight trial spread quickly. In taverns, she became a folk heroine, the nun who laughed at her judges until they trembled. Ballads were sung of her cleverness, her courage, her wit. In them, she was not imprisoned but triumphant, turning the trial into theater, her accusers into actors, her verdict into victory. Historians still debate the line between fact and folklore. Some insist she died quietly. Others claim she escaped disguised as a lay sister and lived another decade among traveling minstrels. One account from an Italian abbey mentions a wandering woman of letters, teaching scripture through laughter and wine. Another from Spain describes a white-veiled saint who cured melancholy by storytelling. Whether real or embellished, the symbolism endures. Her trial by candlelight wasn't just an event, it was a parable. A moment when illumination and accusation met, when flame revealed as much as it condemned. And you can almost feel it, even now. The heat of those candles, the rustle of her habit, the murmur of a woman who refused to let sacred spaces smother sacred thought. In the centuries since, artists have painted her scene again and again, always with the same motif. A figure in a habit standing before flickering candles, her face half in shadow, half in light. They call her La Rio Saint, the laughing saint. Ironically, the church that once condemned her now uses her image to decorate chapels dedicated to joyful devotion. You smile, because that's how history works. It steals the tongues of its rebels and calls them prophets. But tonight, as you stand in that echoing chamber in your mind, the candles burn low again. Their wax drips onto the cold stone table, pooling beside the ink of her recorded sins. And in that wavering light, you realize she never truly stood trial at all. It was the church, not her, that was tested by the fire. And the verdict, centuries later, is still undecided. You hear the wind before you see the road, how it howls through the narrow pass like an animal that's lost its pack. Exile has a sound. It isn't weeping or rage, but the slow hiss of boots over gravel, the whisper of someone learning to walk again after too long on their knees. She walks alone now, wrapped in a tattered wool cloak that still smells faintly of smoke and candle wax. The convent is far behind her, the tribunal a fading echo. They didn't burn her. Burning would have made her famous. Instead, they did something crueler. They let her live. The official sentence reads, perpetual exile from all holy houses and ecclesiastical lands. In simpler terms, Nowhere to go, no one to receive her, not even the church's charity. The word nun has become a curse, the veil, a stigma, and so she walks, step by step, through valleys where even faith loses its voice. The hills are bare. Winter presses close. Villagers stare when she passes, whispering sorcière under their breath. A few toss her crusts of bread. Most cross themselves as if warding off contagion. But she doesn't beg. She never did. At night she sleeps beneath trees, head resting on her folded cloak. She dreams not of heaven but of candlelight, of ink bleeding across parchment, of the sound of laughter forbidden but free. When she wakes, she whispers a prayer she invented herself. Lord, bless my feet for leaving. They finally obey truth. Historians still argue whether her exile was solitary, or if others joined her. One record mentions a group of displaced holy women traveling north in 1359, disguised as pilgrims. Another suggests she joined a band of mendicant preachers who wandered from village to village preaching mercy without permission. Both could be true. She was, after all, a woman of many selves. For a time, she earns her keep as a healer. She gathers herbs from roadside thickets, mixes poultices for fever, charms for childbirth. She speaks gently, works quickly, never takes coin, if food will do. Word spreads of the sister of the wind who cures without judgment. One evening, in a market square near Albi, a merchant recognizes her from a wanted notice nailed to a church door. He calls for guards. She slips into the crowd, vanishes down an alley, and doesn't stop running until the city disappears behind her. That's when she meets them, the bandits. They emerge from the trees at dusk, a ragged assortment of men and women, faces half hidden, eyes sharp. Their leader, a tall man with a scar like lightning down his cheek, raises a hand. "Alms, sister?" he asks mockingly. "Faith," she replies, "but it won't buy you anything." "And I work so, Fran." He laughs, surprised. "You've got nerve for a holy woman." "I'm not holy anymore," she says. "I'm free." He looks at her for a long moment, then tosses her a piece of bread. "Then you'll fit right in." That's how it begins her second life, born not of faith but necessity. At first, they treat her like a curiosity. She prays before meals, quotes scripture in jest, blesses their loot before they divide it. But soon, something shifts. She tends their wounds after fights, mends their clothes, tells stories by the fire. Her laughter softens even the hardest faces. One night, the scarred leader asks, "Do you miss God?" She stares into the flames. "No. I think he followed me." He chuckles. "Then he's a fool." He always was. Historians still debate this period of her life. Some chroniclers call it apocryphal, a later invention meant to romanticize her defiance. Yet local legends persist. Tales of a nun who roamed the forests with outlaws, healing the poor, robbing corrupt clergy, cursing bishops who traveled with too much gold. The church dismissed it as folklore, but folk memory, inconveniently, tends to last longer than archives. One peasant chronicle describes a veiled woman who stopped a hanging by quoting the Gospels. The condemned man was a thief accused of stealing bread. When she stepped from the crowd, the guards hesitated, part fear, part superstition. She said, "Let he who has never stolen a moment of joy cast the first stone." No one moved. She cut the rope herself and vanished before dawn. A quirky tidbit. In several Occitan ballads from the 15th century, a figure known as La Frère Blanche, the White Sister, appears as a companion to bandits who steal from bishops and share wine with widows. Scholars trace her origins to oral tales from the very region where our nun disappeared. Coincidence? Hardly. But she isn't just surviving, she's transforming. The habit she once wore in mockery becomes a disguise again, this time against the church's spies. Her laughter, once a crime, becomes a signal among the bandits. When danger approaches, one of them mimics her sharp, lilting laugh. It carries far through the trees, warning everyone to scatter. Even now, you can almost hear it echoing through the forest like a night bird that refuses to sing the hymns of cages. She never leads them, not officially. But when disputes arise who to rob, what to share, they look to her. The sister decides, they say. Her decisions are strange but fair. She forbids theft from peasants or pilgrims. She demands half of every haul go to nearby villages. Sin, she tells them, is wasted on the selfish. Jester, to disempan nosing mildy. Soon, they're more than thieves. They're folk heroes. Villagers begin leaving bread and wine in hollow trees as offerings for the laughing saint of the woods. Priests denounce her from pulpits. Farmers whisper prayers to her name. And in all this, she finds something she never found inside convent walls: belonging. Yet peace never lingers long. One spring, a caravan passes through the region, carrying relics for a bishop's procession. Gold chalices, jeweled crucifixes, silk vestments, the kind of wealth that could feed a dozen villages for a year. Her companions plan an ambush. She hesitates. To steal from thieves is just accounting, she says. But this will bring trouble. The scarred leader grins. Trouble's the only honest thing left. That night, under a full moon, they strike. The attack is swift, silent. Horses panic. Men shout. Blades flash. She stays behind the line, directing, binding wounds, praying, if you can call it that, for no unnecessary blood. When it's over, the loot is theirs. Among the spoils, she finds a silver reliquary. Its label claims it holds a saint's finger bone. She opens it. Inside, nothing but dust. She laughs, loud and free. Even the saints escape when they can. One curly savor. They divide the gold, share the bread, pour wine for the dead. But their victory doesn't last. By morning, soldiers are on their trail. The church moves faster than mercy when its treasure is touched. They flee into the hills, hunted for weeks. One by one, the band falls apart. Captured, scattered, killed. She and the scarred man remain together, longest, hiding in a cave above the valley. He's wounded, arrow lodged deep in his shoulder. She tends to him, pressing cloth to the wound. "Don't die yet," she says softly. "You still owe me a story." He laughs weakly. "You're the story, sister." When he dies 2 days later, she buries him beneath wild thyme and prays in silence. Then she strips his cloak for warmth and moves on. Historians still argue whether this was the moment she turned from outlaw to legend, because after that, the stories multiply. Some say she began traveling alone, carrying a staff marked with a small carved cross. Others claim she disguised herself as a wandering friar, teaching kindness in taverns. A 14th century tax record even lists one unknown pilgrim in the garb of a monk, preaching laughter in exchange for bread. It could be her. It likely was. What's undeniable is that by the time the soldiers finally stopped searching, her trail had become myth. Peasants told of a veiled woman who appeared at night to bless children, mend fences, or whisper secrets of healing to midwives. She comes with the wind, they said, and leaves the smell of wine and wildflowers. The church, of course, condemned her as a fugitive soul. A papal edict in 1362 warned that a certain apostate nun spreads false miracles and laughter among the ignorant. Yet even that condemnation proved her existence and ensured her immortality. A mainstream historical fact. Outlaw bands in medieval France often included women healers, widows, even former nuns. Many fled convents during famine or plague. The church called them apostates, but local communities often revered them as wise women, protectors, even saints. Our nun fits seamlessly into this larger, inconvenient truth. Faith, once loosed from hierarchy, doesn't disappear, it adapts. You see her now, years after the trial, walking again through forest light. She's older, yes, but her step is sure. Her eyes still hold that same spark. She hums as she goes, half hymn, half tavern tune. In her satchel, a few herbs, a flask of wine, and one tattered scrap of parchment. Her own words, written long ago. Truth travels faster than chains can hold it. When night falls, she builds a small fire. Its smoke curls upward like prayer. She sits beside it, pulls the hood of the bandit's cloak over her head, and watches the flames dance. Somewhere far away, a church bell tolls. She smiles. Still ringing for the same sins, I see. She drinks from her flask, leans back against a tree, and closes her eyes. The forest hums. The air smells of time and freedom. And if you listen closely beyond the crackle of the fire, beyond the whisper of leaves, you might swear you hear it again. That soft, irrepressible laugh that once shook cathedrals. She isn't gone. Not yet. Not ever, really. Because some exiles become prophets. And some rebels, when driven from the altar, simply take the light with them. The road is no longer a punishment. It has become a pulse. Every bend, every stretch of dust between forests, feels like another heartbeat in the body of freedom she's been stitching together since the day the church cast her out. You follow her through that widening world past ruined abbeys, across markets, thick with spice and rumor, through villages where her name is half curse, half prayer, and everywhere she goes, stories follow. They say she rides with thieves now, not behind them, but beside them. The laughing sister, cloaked in gray, her eyes like polished flint, her laughter echoing from hill to hill before the bells can catch it. It begins in Gascony, if the old tales are right. A band of horsemen, smugglers, poachers, outlaws, find her tending to an injured child by the roadside. She's humming as she works, binding the wound with steady hands, her cloak splattered with blood that isn't her own. The men watch from their saddles. Their leader, a broad man named Bertrand, calls out, "That's no nun's work, sister." She looks up. Then it's a better nun's work than most. The sane and the scrated fur. He laughs, loud and honest. "You've got spirit. Come with us, our kind could use a woman who prays to someone other than fear." She doesn't answer right away. But when the wind shifts, she hears the bells of a distant monastery, faint and hollow, like the memory of chains. "All right," she says, "but only if you stop calling me sister." "What should we call you then?" Bertrand asks. "Alive," she says. From that night on, she rides. They give her a horse, a pale creature with a streak of gold down its nose. She names it Mercy, though no one dares laugh. She rides with her back straight, veil tucked beneath her hood, the rosary around her wrist like a whip. At first, she watches. She learns their trade, how to move unseen, how to spot guards by the gleam of their helmets, how to judge the worth of a wagon by its wheels. She never steals for greed, she steals for balance. If sin is a scale, she tells them, someone has to tip it toward justice. Historians still debate whether this period is fact or legend. Some claim she led no true robberies, but rather sheltered fugitives and redistributed church tithes to starving peasants. Yet others record her as the Grey Rider, a figure blamed for raids on ecclesiastical caravans. Whatever the truth, the myth grows because it feels truer than paper. Once, a chronicler wrote of a woman in a tattered veil who halted a bishop's procession and demanded alms for widows. When the bishop refused, she took his purse and left him a note. "I have merely shortened the distance between charity and action. There's some altar due, 17 rated." The note, preserved in the cathedral archives of Bordeaux, bears a flourish at the bottom, a small sketch of a laughing mouth. Her band becomes more than thieves. They become her disciples of defiance. She teaches them small mercies. No killing unless in defense. No hoarding. "We take only what fear can spare," she says. At first, Bertrand scoffs. "Fear spares nothing." "Then we take nothing from those who have nothing left," she replies. Soon, her rules shape them. They rob tax collectors and corrupt abbots, caravans stuffed with relics bought by indulgences. They leave notes pinned to the wagons. Saints don't need gold. A quirky tidbit from a 15th century ballad mentions a group called Les Fils du Vent, the Sons of the Wind, who followed a nun who could make a bishop cry and a drunkard pray. The refrain goes, "She rode by moon, she rode by flame, and the cross she wore was none but her name." That refrain survives to this day in rural folk songs, though few remember its origin. She laughs often now, not mockery, but the deep, unguarded laughter of someone who's finally living her own gospel. Around the campfire, she tells stories of saints who secretly doubted, of angels who envied human hunger, of God himself wandering the earth disguised as a fool, because only fools still listen. The men drink and listen, wide-eyed. One night, a young outlaw named Matthew asks, "Do you really believe he listens?" She nods toward the dark woods. "He's out there somewhere, still deciding if he should forgive himself." The others laugh. But it's the kind of laughter that sits in the chest and makes the heart ache. Historians still argue over one particular episode, the raid of St. Martin. In 1364, a heavily guarded convoy carrying indulgence funds was ambushed near the Dordogne River. Eyewitnesses claimed the attackers were led by a veiled woman reciting the Magnificat as the guards fled. The treasure vanished, and weeks later, bread was distributed freely across 20 villages. Officially, no one was ever caught. Unofficially, the church blamed the apostate nun of the woods. "In man's slave, he have help." It said that after the raid, she and her band hid in the mountains, living in a cave lined with flickering candles. Each night, they read from stolen missals and rewrote the prayers in their own words. One of those rewritten prayers survives in oral tradition. Blessed are the broken, for they will not break others. Blessed are the thieves who steal back dignity. Blessed are the laughing, for they remember joy. That kind of poetry doesn't vanish. It becomes legend, because it deserves to. But not everyone loves her legend. The church, humiliated and hungry for control, sends bounty hunters. The crown, too, wants her caught not for her crimes, but for the embarrassment. A woman leading men, living without confession, laughing in the face of God's anointed. Such insolence spreads faster than plague. One by one, her companions fall. Bertrand dies in an ambush. Matthew vanishes in a snowstorm. Others scatter into obscurity. Only she remains unbroken. The chronicles grow dim after this point. Some claim she turned fully nomadic, riding alone from France into the Pyrenees. Others say she crossed into Aragon disguised as a pilgrim. One Spanish monastery's records mention a mysterious nun who appeared during famine, leading pack mules laden with bread. She refused payment and disappeared before dawn. A friar recorded, "Her laughter was the sound of rain after drought." By now, her hair is silver. Her hands, once ink-stained, are calloused from rains and road dust. Yet she carries herself with the same quiet authority, the kind born not from power, but from having nothing left to lose. One night, as she camps beside a river, she speaks aloud to no one in particular. "They thought to banish me from holy ground, but the earth is holy, and I walk on it. They thought to silence me with exile, but the wind carries laughter farther than bells. Is made my addition dollars, my languor are not a reacher." She drinks from her flask, tears bread, and tosses crumbs to the water. "Communion," she murmurs, "for fish, not priests." A mainstream fact. The 14th century was an age of faith-fracturing plagues, schisms, and heresies spreading like wildfire. Against that backdrop, her story reads less as fantasy and more as reflection. There were countless wanderers like her, disillusioned mystics, expelled nuns, visionaries with nothing left but the wild. The church called them heretics. History calls them the beginning of reform. Her fame or infamy spreads south. In Provence, people claim she healed plague victims with wine. In Navarre, she's credited with stopping a nobleman's cruelty by preaching until his sword turned to rust. In one tale, she rides straight into a battlefield, her cloak whipping in the smoke, shouting, "There are no sinners here, only starving souls." The soldiers stop fighting. Both sides lay down arms for an hour, stunned by her voice. Was it real? Historians still debate, but witnesses, it seems, never forgot. By this time, songs about her circulate in 3 languages. One describes her as the thief of despair. Another, sung by shepherds, calls her the nun who stole God's smile. We have a never side. You realize she's become something larger than a woman, a myth, balancing on the edge between rebellion and sainthood. But she knows what myths cost. As she grows older, solitude finds her again. The men she rode with are gone. The villages she helped forget her face but remember her laughter. She lives quietly in the hills, teaching children how to read, midwives how to mix herbs, farmers how to hide grain from greedy tithe collectors. When a traveler asks her name, she smiles. "Once, I was Sister Benedetta. Then I was nobody. Now I'm whoever you need me to be." And rementure inside of Hey Wide, she carries a satchel filled with small miracles, a rosary missing its cross, a quill carved from a crow's feather, and a single candle stub that never seems to burn out. One winter evening, as snow begins to fall, she takes refuge in a shepherd's hut. The firelight flickers against the walls. She opens her journal, a scrap of leather filled with half-legible ink, and writes what will be her final recorded words. "I have worn the veil and the bandit's cloak, and both fit badly. I have loved truth more than peace, and laughter more than obedience. I do not know if God forgives me, but I forgive him for waiting so long to make the world this beautiful." Historians believe this entry was found decades later, preserved in a hollow tree near the Spanish border. Whether she left it there as confession or farewell, no one knows. When spring comes, shepherds claim they see her horse grazing alone on a ridge, saddle empty, cloak folded neatly nearby. They bury the cloak beneath wildflowers. The legend says her laughter was heard one last time that evening rolling down the valley like thunder softened by distance. Some say she became a saint without relics, a martyr without fire, a ghost of grace who refused extinction. Others think she simply kept riding, outpacing even death. And maybe that's truer, because the last anyone swears to have seen of her was a figure on a pale horse crossing the mountains at dawn, cloak snapping like a flag of defiance, face lifted toward the Sunday. The nun who rode with thieves, the thief who stole holiness back from the hands that hoarded it. And somewhere in the wind that followed, faint but unmistakable, was laughter. The first miracle didn't look like a miracle at all. It was small, almost shy, like the way dawn slips over the hills without fanfare, too humble to announce itself. In the winter after her disappearance from the bandits' camp, a drought struck the southern valleys. Wells dried, fields cracked, and even the priests stopped pretending their prayers could summon rain. Then one morning, a shepherd claimed he saw a veiled woman kneeling beside the dry riverbed, whispering into the dust. He swore he heard laughter soft, strange, not mocking but intimate, as if she were telling a joke to the earth itself. That evening, clouds rolled in from nowhere. It rained for 3 days straight. The river returned, and with it, the rumor. The laughing nun had spoken to heaven, and heaven had finally answered. Historians, of course, dismiss this as coincidence. But the villagers who saw the river swell didn't care for coincidences. They left loaves of bread and small bottles of wine at the riverbank in thanks, whispering, "For the sister who talks to God like an equal." That was the beginning. Over the next decade, stories of her miracles multiplied like mushrooms after rain. She wasn't called heretic anymore, at least, not by the people. To them, she was something stranger, holier, freer, the fallen sister who still glowed. The second miracle came in the village of Saint Hilaire, where a plague had taken nearly everyone. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and sorrow. Those who survived hid indoors, terrified to breathe. One night, a hooded figure appeared at the chapel door. The priest tried to drive her away, crying, "No one enters. Death walks here." She smiled. "Then I'm right on time. Body a command possipt." She spent the night moving from house to house, washing the dead, comforting the dying. She left a bowl of herbs steeped in wine at every door. By morning, the fever had broken in the surviving children. No one knew what she'd mixed, but the villagers called it Christ's wine. Y was to see from the after in the molten righted, and B see after in the molten righted. With I was to people, a quirky tidbit. An herbal recipe written in Occitan from the same period survives, titled La Potion de la Sœur du Vent. It contains rosemary, thyme, honey, and red wine boiled under moonlight, a concoction medieval healers later copied across southern France. Historians can't prove she invented it, but her legend certainly inspired it. She refused to take credit. "The cure was already in your hands," she told the priest. "I just reminded them what to hold." Words spread faster than parchment could record. Merchants whispered her name like a charm on dangerous roads. Midwives claimed their births went smoother when they prayed to her. Even a few monks quietly, secretly quoted her sayings in sermons, pretending they came from the Desert Fathers. One of those sayings, preserved in a 15th century notebook, reads, "Grace falls where laughter has already loosened the soil, but with miracles come hunters. The church could forgive thieves. It could tolerate eccentric mystics. But miracles real or imagined were power, and power had to be owned. A woman performing them without sanction was intolerable. So, they sent another inquiry. This one was smaller, quieter. No tribunal this time, no grand spectacle. Just 2 inquisitors and a handful of soldiers, carrying letters sealed with red wax. They traveled from town to town, collecting stories, interrogating peasants. "Did you see her heal the sick?" "No. But my cousin did." "Did you hear her preach?" "Only that she made the children laugh." "And when one self-calm, remosta be faces, the self-calm do." They found nothing tangible, only laughter, rumors, and gratitude. Still, they wrote their report. "A woman known as the Laughing Sister works false wonders. Her words breed rebellion disguised as joy." And de France per 40 self too. When the report reached Rome, the cardinal in charge simply wrote one word in the margin: dangerous. Meanwhile, the miracles continued. One tale tells of a convent in Provence, struck by lightning during a storm. The roof collapsed, trapping the sisters inside. As they prayed for deliverance, a stranger appeared, tall, cloaked, face half hidden by a hood. She helped dig them out, soothed their burns, and vanished before dawn. They found her rosary left behind, each bead carved not with a cross but with a small, smiling face. Another story speaks of a relic theft in Toulouse. A monastery claimed its prized reliquary, the finger bone of Saint Cecilia, had vanished overnight. In its place was a note written in fine, slanted script. She sang for joy, not for proof. Valens self of water in dies well. Historians still argue whether she truly took the relic, or if the story grew out of tavern gossip. But it became a favorite parable among the poor, the saint who freed saints from their cages. A mainstream fact. Relic theft, or furta sacra, was common in the Middle Ages, often justified as holy relocation. Many believed relics moved of their own accord to where they were most needed. Her legend merely takes that logic to its most poetic extreme. The final miracle, if you can call it that, came near the end of her wandering years. She'd grown thin and gray, her laughter softer but still dangerous. The world around her had changed, wars raged, the church fractured, new heresies bloomed like weeds after centuries of rain. But she had no interest in grand theology. She simply kept walking. In the spring of 1372, a small hamlet on the edge of the Pyrenees was buried under snow. The villagers huddled in the church, freezing, starving, waiting for help that never came. Then, through the blizzard, they saw a figure on horseback, cloaked in gray. She carried sacks of grain across her saddle, though the nearest storehouse was 10 miles away. She dismounted, handed the grain to the villagers, and warmed herself by their dwindling fire. When they asked how she'd crossed the mountains, she said, "When the wind knows your name, the snow steps aside." By morning, she was gone again. The villagers swore her footprints led to the edge of a frozen stream and stopped there. The horse tracks continued across the ice, but hers vanished. Historians still debate whether this final appearance was literal or symbolic. The chronicler of Foix, writing decades later, refers to a veiled angel who rode through the storm, but her story had long since outgrown the boundaries of belief, because by now her miracles had become metaphors. Rain was renewal, healing was defiance, disappearance was transcendence. Even the church eventually conceded defeat, not publicly, but practically. They stopped sending inquisitors, they stopped speaking her name. Silence became their only defense against her immortality. But silence, as she once said, is porous. In the centuries that followed, her legend bled into every corner of Europe. Painters depicted her as a wandering saint, surrounded by candles that never went out. Poets wrote of her as the bride who divorced heaven. Women invoked her during childbirth, farmers during droughts, lovers during separation. One anonymous 15th century prayer survives, carved into the back of a wooden rosary. Blessed be she who spoke with laughter when the world demanded weep. 1. A quirky folkloric detail. In some regions of southern France, farmers still pour the first sip of new wine on the ground and say, "Pour la sœur tombée," for the fallen sister. They say it keeps storms away. You realize then that her miracles never depended on divine approval. They weren't about magic or relics or saints descending from heaven. They were about reclaiming wonder from fear, about remembering that holiness was never meant to live only in stone or Latin or silence. And maybe that's the truest miracle of all. She changed what holiness meant. Imagine her now, older, slower, walking through a meadow at dusk. The air hums with crickets. She pauses by a small shrine, a stone cross half covered in moss, and lays her hand on it. "Still trying to reach him?" she murmurs. "You might do better listening." A breeze stirs. The candles at the base flicker, as if in answer. She laughs, low and warm. "There you go," she says. She keeps walking, leaving no footprints this time. Just laughter carried by the wind and the faint scent of wine and thyme. Historians will go on debating whether she was real, whether she sinned, whether she performed miracles or simply refused to die quietly. But you, sitting here in the hush of this late-night story, can feel it, the pull of her presence, the pulse of something ungoverned. You can almost hear her voice, just over your shoulder. "Miracle?" she whispers. "That's just a word men invented when women did something they couldn't explain." And as the last candle gutters in your imagination, you realize she's right. The miracles of the fallen sister were never proof of God. They were proof of life, stubborn, laughing, unrepentant life. By the time her name reached Rome, it no longer belonged to her. It had become a contagion, a whisper traded between pilgrims and scholars, a rumor that slipped into sermons like dust through a crack in stained glass. No one knew where she lived anymore, or even if she lived at all, but the idea of her, the laughter of her, refused to die. Letters arrived from bishops, frantic and contradictory. Some praised her as a vessel of divine humor. Others condemned her as the devil in disguise. One papal aide complained that peasants had begun ending prayers with, "As the sister laughs, so may our hearts." A blasphemy, yes, but also a comfort. The Vatican, by nature, does not like comfort it cannot control. So, one humid spring morning, 3 men were summoned to a marble chamber that smelled of ink and anxiety. They were inquisitors of reputation, sharp minds wrapped in sharper robes. Their task, to investigate the apostate woman known as the Laughing Nun, whose deeds, whether diabolical or divine, have disrupted the peace of Christendom. They bowed, accepted their orders, and left with the confidence of men who believe the world is still measurable by scroll and seal. They had no idea they were chasing a ghost who'd already outgrown her body. Meanwhile, far from Rome's corridors, she was crossing the foothills of the Pyrenees again, older but not diminished. Her hair was a soft silver now, her hands lined like rivers on a map. She traveled lightly, just her cloak, a water skin, a pouch of herbs, and the candle stub she never seemed to finish. At night she stayed in barns or under bridges, whispering stories to children, blessing bread, trading laughter for lodging. Her voice had softened with age, but not with surrender. "Faith," she told a farmer's wife once, "isn't a wall. It's the hole you peer through." She no longer called herself a nun. She no longer called herself anything. But when people knelt before her, asking for prayers, she never refused. "All right," she would sigh. "But only if you promise to listen for the punchline." That was her theology now, a gospel of gentle rebellion, each miracle a reminder that the sacred should breathe, not suffocate. But laughter, as ever, draws lightning. The inquisitors arrived in Avignon first, following rumors like breadcrumbs. They interviewed abbots, merchants, innkeepers. They gathered contradictory stories. She was a healer, a thief, a prophet, a witch. One said she'd walked across a river without wetting her feet. Another swore she'd been buried years ago. The lead inquisitor, a man named Father Tommaso, began to suspect something worse than heresy metaphor. "She is not one woman," he told his companions. "She is infection, a disease of imagination." He was right, though he didn't know it. In one village near the Rhone, they arrived a day too late. A child had been dying of fever. A veiled woman no one knew from where had appeared at dusk, laid a damp cloth on his brow, and whispered something that made him laugh in his sleep. By morning, the fever was gone. The inquisitors interrogated the mother. "What did she say?" "She said." The woman replied, trembling, "That joy is the only proof of breath." They burned her house for sheltering a heretic. The boy survived anyway. Back in Rome, the reports piled up, each more absurd than the last. She turns soldiers aside with a song. She steals relics and leaves bread. She heals without prayer. She teaches women to read. That last one, perhaps, was the most dangerous. The Pope himself, Urban V, by most accounts, received the dossier. He was an old man by then, weary from politics and schism. He read in silence, the candlelight trembling across his face. At length he said, "If she is false, she will fade. If she is true, God will make her inconvenient. Either way, we shall hear of her again. Seems not." But the Curia could not abide his patience. Pressure mounted. The reports continued. Finally, the Pope relented. A formal bull was drafted. On the matter of the wandering nun of laughter, who disturbs the faithful and mocks the sacraments. Find Saint Helver. She was to be captured and brought to Rome alive if possible, silent if not. Historians still argue whether this bull was ever sealed. Some claim it never left the Vatican. Others insist a copy reached France. But either way, the effect was the same. Every monk, every friar, every spy of the church now knew her name. Meanwhile, she was sitting by a river, mending a child's torn shoe. She didn't know she was famous again. Or maybe she did, and it simply didn't matter. The river glimmered gold in the afternoon light. She smiled at her reflection and said, "You look tired, old friend." The water rippled, as if agreeing. She wandered south that summer, toward the coast, drawn by the promise of salt and silence. But her path was no longer secret. Soldiers watched the roads, preachers warned of the laughing witch. In one town, a painting of her was nailed to a church door, a crude likeness, but close enough. The caption read, "Beware the woman who heals with laughter." When she saw it, she simply added beneath in charcoal, "Better that than the man who kills with silence." The townsfolk snickered. The soldiers tore it down. By morning, 10 new copies had appeared. One night, she was cornered. It happened in the hills above Narbonne. The Inquisitor's men caught her while she gathered herbs beneath the moon. They dragged her to a campfire, bound her wrists, demanded her name. "Which one?" she asked. "Your true one," Father Tommaso said. She studied him for a moment, the firelight painting his face in flickering amber. "I doubt you'd believe it. Try me." She leaned forward, the chains rattling softly. "I am laughter born from obedience. The echo of your sermons when no one's listening. The sigh your God gives when he realizes you've mistaken him for fear." He stared at her, jaw tight. "You mock the divine. Thanks for watching." "No," she said. "I remind it to smile." He struck her then, not hard, but enough to break the silence. She turned her face back slowly, blood at her lip, and laughed. That laugh haunted him for the rest of his life. They brought her before a bishop in Carcassonne. He demanded repentance. She refused. He threatened excommunication. She shrugged. "You can't exile me from what I've already left," she said. When the bishop ordered her flogged, the whip broke on the second strike. The handle splintered clean in two. The guards refused to continue. One fell to his knees, muttering, "It's a sign, a quirky tidbit." In the archives of Carcassonne, there exists an incident report dated 1375, describing the failed punishment of an unnamed woman accused of heresy. The document concludes, "Her laughter disrupted the proceedings. Many of the witnesses wept uncontrollably and could not explain why. Whether miracle or hysteria, it sealed her legend." After that, she vanished once more. The inquisitors searched the countryside, but found nothing. No body, no tracks, no bones. Some said she escaped to Catalonia, disguised as a pilgrim. Others swore she died on the road, and the earth hid her in gratitude. But months later, pilgrims returning from Rome brought strange news. Someone had left a loaf of bread and a bottle of wine on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. No note, no footprints. Only a single carved bead beside the offering, a small, smiling face. The Vatican quietly collected it. The artifact still exists, catalogued as unknown devotional, 14th century. Historians still argue whether this final gesture was hers, a disciple's, or simply legend. Yet even the skeptics admit, if she had lived to defy Rome one last time, she would have done it not with rage, but with generosity. As for Father Tommaso, the inquisitor who struck her, he resigned a year later. His letters, preserved in a Florentine archive, reveal the transformation that haunted him. She said she was laughter, and now I hear it everywhere. In bells, in wind, in my own prayers. I tried to silence her, but perhaps she was sent to silence me. When one-sided before, and am not to unwind. He became a recluse afterward, tending vines in a monastery garden until his death. The novices called him the smiling monk. You can see, then, how Rome's notice meant to destroy her only magnified her. Every attempt to contain her multiplied her reach. In time, even the Vatican softened. A century later, during a homily on divine joy, a Dominican preacher quoted her words unknowingly. "The soul that forgets to laugh, forgets to breathe." The irony would have delighted her. Picture her, then, one last time somewhere near the sea perhaps, walking along a rocky shore as gulls circle overhead. The wind whips her cloak, salt stings her lips, and the horizon glows with that gold only late light can offer. She pauses, leans on her staff, and watches the waves break. "Rome notices everything too late," she murmurs. Then she lifts her face toward the wind and laughs, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the weary, radiant humor of someone who has seen too much and forgiven it anyway. It is the laugh of freedom, seasoned with sorrow, of rebellion aged into wisdom, the kind that makes even the gods stop pretending they aren't listening. They find her at dawn, not in hiding this time, not slipping through trees or vanishing into storms, but sitting openly by the roadside, her cloak drawn close, her horse grazing nearby, the faintest smile resting on her lips, as though she's been expecting them all along. The soldiers approach warily, as if the very air around her might burst into laughter and unmake their courage. She looks up, calm, eyes bright with a serenity that isn't submission. "You took your time," she says. Their captain, a weary man with more scars than certainty, gestures for her to rise. "By order of His Holiness, you are to be taken to Avignon for questioning." "Questioning," she echoes softly, tying her cloak. "It's always questioning with you men, never listening." A should disguide. He hesitates, unsure whether to strike her or pray. Instead, he sighs. "You'll ride with us." "I prefer walking," she says. "But I'll humor you. It's your journey, after all." And so, she is captured, if you can call it that, without struggle, without spectacle. But captivity is a relative thing, and she knows how to wear it like a borrowed cloak. The journey south takes 2 weeks. Along the way, the soldiers find her disarming. She thanks them for bread, tends their wounds, hums old hymns around the fire. One night, she mends a torn sleeve for the captain and tells him a story about a saint who mistook her own shadow for the devil. "It's a comforting mistake," she says. "At least it means the light's still behind you." Even the most devout among them find themselves smiling. One confesses he joined the guard to escape famine, not serve faith. She listens, nods, then says, "God forgives hunger. It's appetite He struggles with." Historians still argue about this journey, whether she charmed her captors through grace or guile. A surviving letter from a lieutenant describes her as unlike any prisoner I have known. Her words undo the will like warm wine. They arrive in Avignon on a Sunday. Bells ring for Mass. The streets smell of rain and incense. She's taken to a small monastery converted into a holding cell for religious offenders. Her cell is clean, simple: a cot, a crucifix, a narrow window facing the Rhone. The inquisitors come that evening. 3 of them, all in black. Their leader, Father Tommaso, older now, weary but not unkind. He recognizes her immediately. "I thought you vanished." "I did," she says. "You just didn't notice." He folds his hands. "You've become legend." "Legends," she replies, "are just truths that outlived their manners." He sighs. "You mock even now." "Always. It's how I breathe." By the any market can be canned of the wave. He opens the ledger before him. "Do you understand the charges against you?" "I stopped keeping track," she says. The words change, the fear stays the same. Her tone is gentle, almost sympathetic. He's silent for a moment, then says, "Rome wants a confession. Something to end this story. This would fames to us nine." She tilts her head. "You can end stories, Father, not laughter." They question her for days. Each morning, she's brought to the refectory-turned-tribunal. Each evening, she returns to her cell humming, untouched by fatigue. They accuse her of heresy, of leading thieves, of performing false miracles. "You turned water to wine. Only once. And the water asked for it. You denied obedience." "I denied obedience to cruelty." "You made peasants laugh at priests." They were laughing at fear, not faith. "Being and to lt. Sedge." She never denies what she's done, but she refuses to apologize. Her words, copied down by scribes, become more parable than defense. At one point, a younger inquisitor, trembling with anger, slams his fist on the table. "You think this is a game?" "Yes," she says, "but the stakes are souls, and you've forgotten how to play." Even Father Tommaso has to hide a smile. One night, he visits her cell alone. The candles burn low. The air smells of wax and something older melancholy, perhaps. "You could make this easy," he says quietly. "A signed retraction. We would release you to a convent. You could live out your years in peace." "Peace," she repeats, gazing out the window. "That sounds like a polite name for silence." He studies her. "Why do you persist? You've lost everything: status, safety, even your name." "Lies. 4 of 4. She turns toward him, eyes glinting in the candlelight. "Everything except the part that listens when I laugh. That's enough." He shakes his head. "You're impossible." "So was Christ," she says. "You crucified him for smiling too kindly at sinners." Beisagel. The next morning, the guards report that her cell smells faintly of wine. None can explain it. The flask on her table is dry. Rumors spread among the novices. She's working miracles again. Father Tommaso orders silence. There are no miracles here, he says. Only misunderstanding. Brevardis that perding stores. But late at night, even he admits, he hears her voice echoing faintly through the corridor, soft, amused, unafraid. The trial drags on. Outside, crowds gather each day. Some come to condemn her, others to glimpse the woman who defied Rome. Vendors sell wooden beads carved with smiling faces. The church declares them blasphemous. They sell out anyway. Inside, her interrogation grows stranger. She no longer answers questions directly. Instead, she tells parables. To, "Do you believe in the church?" She replies, "The church believes in itself too much to need me." 2. "Do you repent?" She says, "Every morning, for sleeping too long." 2. "Do you deny Christ?" She says, "No. I just think he laughs more than you remember." A mainstream fact. Inquisitorial records show that trials often devolved into performance. Accused mystics used wit and paradox to undermine authority, creating what scholars now call the theater of heresy. Her trial became exactly that, a stage where she turned every accusation into allegory. On the 10th day, a storm hits Avignon. Thunder rolls through the city. Rain lashes the cathedral spires. The tribunal gathers anyway. The hall is dim, candles trembling. "You stand before us for the last time," Father Tommaso declares. "We offer mercy once more. Renounce your heresies and live." She rises slowly, her cloak pooling around her feet. "You've mistaken laughter for rebellion, Father. I don't reject your God, I just think he's tired of being your weapon." The younger inquisitor snarls, "Blasphemy." But she continues, voice rising over the storm. "Faith was never meant to fear questions. Holiness was never meant to starve joy. You say I mock the church, but look at you. You've built prisons out of psalms and called them sanctuaries. You've gilded chains and called them salvation." Lightning flashes through the windows, lighting her face in white fire. "If laughter is heresy," she cries, "then heaven must be full of sinners." For a heartbeat, the hall is silent. Then thunder crashes, and every candle goes out. When light returns, she is still standing calm, eyes closed, smiling faintly. Father Tommaso lowers his head. "So be it," he says quietly. "They sentence her to perpetual imprisonment. Not death would make her a martyr. Instead, they seal her in a remote monastery north of Avignon, a house known for its silence. She leaves the city at dawn, escorted by 4 guards. The streets are lined with onlookers. Some spit, some weep. One child throws her a flower. She catches it, tucks it behind her ear, and winks. "Still laughing?" a soldier mutters. "Always," she says. It keeps the air moving. He's full now. At the silent monastery, they confine her to a single room with no window, only a narrow slit for light. The door is bolted from outside. She receives food once a day through a hatch. But within a week, the sisters claim they hear music from her cell. Not instruments, just humming, rhythmic and haunting. The abbess orders the sisters to ignore it. But they can't. The sound spreads, rising through the cloisters, threading through prayers, until the whole house hums without realizing it. When Father Tommaso visits months later, he hears it too. "You've infected them," he says through the door. "Not infected," she replies, reminded. He sighs. "Of what?" "That silence is never empty. It's just waiting for a song." Historians still debate her final years. Some say she died quietly in that cell, body found kneeling, face serene. Others claim the cell was found empty one morning, the door still locked, the walls faintly glowing with candle soot shaped like laughter lines. A quirky note in the monastery ledger records the day of her disappearance. "Our sister is gone. The air smells of wine and rain. We will sing at vespers tonight." Decades later, pilgrims visiting the ruins of that monastery claim to hear faint music in the wind. Locals began calling it the Sisters' Song. Sailors swore it carried over the Rhone during storms, mingling with thunder. Modern researchers call it superstition, wind through the cracks. But perhaps the wind simply remembers, because some voices, once freed, never leave the world, they just learn new ways to travel. You can see her even now, barefoot, walking through dawn mist, no longer young but utterly alive. Around her neck hangs a wooden rosary, the beads worn smooth from use. Each bead still bears that same carving, a small, smiling face. She touches one, then looks toward the horizon, where the first sunlight gilds the hills. "Well," she murmurs, "I suppose even Rome will laugh one day. The may my nuisant of herself, for," and she walks on, light as breath, the world behind her still echoing with the sound of miracles disguised as jokes. It begins, as ghost stories always do, with footsteps where there should be none. A creak in the hall after Compline. A flicker in the candlelight when all the sisters are asleep. A laugh soft, low, the kind that rises just once before dissolving into still air. Years have passed since her last trial, and time, like moss, has covered the sharp edges of memory. The world outside moves on. Kings die. Wars shift borders. New priests argue about old sins. But inside the cloisters of France and Italy, among convents that have long forgotten their namesake saints, her shadow remains. They call her La Rieuse Sainte, the laughing saint, though no one dares say it too loudly. The church has never canonized her, but the people have. They light candles in her name, whisper her jokes as prayers, and claim that wherever despair grows too thick, she appears. The first official record comes from 1411, in a convent near Avignon, the same city where she once stood trial. The abbess writes in her diary, "During Vespers, a candle relit itself after extinguishing 3 times. The novices laughed without cause, and one claimed to see a woman standing by the window. She wore no veil, yet light poured from her hair like dawn. When we approached, she was gone, but her scent, wine, and time remained." Historians dismiss this as hysteria or mass suggestion, but the pattern repeats. In Siena, a nun claims she dreamt of a cloaked woman who told her, "Write your prayers as laughter, not tears." The next morning, the nun awakes to find her inkwell refilled, though she remembers emptying it the night before. In Rouen, an entire refectory bursts into spontaneous laughter during Lent after a novice accidentally spills wine. The abbess, furious, orders penance. That night, every candle in the hall burns blue and refuses to go out until the morning bell. The sisters whisper, "She's come again." The church investigates, of course. In each case, they find no evidence of trickery, only testimonies, oddly similar, and one recurring phrase scratched into wood, parchment, or candle wax. Still laughing. Ghost stories are, in their own way, histories that refuse to die. They survive when truth becomes inconvenient, when paper burns and names are forbidden. Her legend shifts shape with each telling. In Spain, she becomes La Monja del Vino, the wine nun who appears during harvests, blessing barrels with invisible hands so the wine never sours. In Brittany, she's Sœur de la Pluie, the sister of rain, whose laughter breaks droughts. In Italy, she is La Donna che parla con Dio come un amico, the woman who speaks to God like a friend. Even sailors carry her myth. They claim she rides the storm clouds and steadies ships by whispering to the wind. "Laugh for me," she supposedly says. "The sea listens better when it's amused. I resow my taming, and is notly for purtes." A quirky tidbit. In a 17th century chapel in Marseille, restorers found graffiti carved under the altar table, dozens of tiny smile marks, each accompanied by the same initials, B.S. Some scholars think it stands for Benedetta Sorella. Others, more romantically, say it means Benedicta Spiritus, Blessed Spirit. Either way, it's her handwriting, or the idea of it. The most famous sighting happens in 1472, nearly a century after her death or disappearance, depending on who tells it. It occurs at St. Clare's Abbey, a convent known for its severe silence. One night, during Compline, the sisters kneel in prayer. Suddenly, the organ, silent for years, begins to play. The notes are soft, melancholy, strangely joyful. Then, a voice joins it. A woman's voice, clear as moonlight, singing in Latin. Beatus qui ridet, quia Deus ridet cum eo. Blessed is the one who laughs, for God laughs with her. The sisters panic. One faints. The abbess screams for silence. But the voice continues, weaving through the hall until every candle flares bright, illuminating a figure standing near the choir stall. A woman in a gray cloak, barefoot, smiling. When the light fades, she is gone. The organ stops. The silence that follows is so complete it feels alive. Historians, of course, call it myth, But an entry in the abbess's private ledger confirms at least the date. This night, the impossible sang. There are darker versions of the story too. In one 16th century Jesuit tract, she's rebranded as a demon, a spirit of mockery sent to undo piety. They claim her laughter drives monks to madness, her face appears in wine cups, her voice whispers doubts into the ears of confessors. But if you read between the lines, even the fear sounds like awe. A friar writes, "She comes when the heart grows too heavy, when penance rots into pride. She touches the mind with mirth, and in that instant, all solemnity collapses." He meant it as warning. It reads like prayer. A mainstream fact. Medieval Christianity often feared joy. Scholars like Johann Huizinga note how laughter was seen as worldly, corrupting, a sign of the flesh intruding upon the soul. Saints were meant to suffer, not smile, which makes her persistent centuries of laughter echoing through sanctuaries all the more miraculous. She becomes, unintentionally, the patron of contradiction, a ghost who haunts institutions not to frighten them, but to remind them to breathe. In some accounts, she appears to reformers before their revelations. Martin Luther, in one apocryphal tale, dreams of a veiled woman offering him a goblet of wine and saying, "Stop arguing, start laughing." He wakes, writes his theses, and later admits to feeling as though a jest had saved my soul. Coincidence? Perhaps, but even revolutions need humor to stay human. By the 18th century, her story has faded from theology, but flourished in folklore. Enlightenment writers adore her, a rational ghost who mocks superstition yet lives within it. Voltaire calls her the saint the church accidentally deserved. In taverns from Lyon to Lisbon, actors perform plays about her. The nun who stole heaven, the saint who laughed back, wine and wonder. Every generation remakes her. Artists paint her as a trickster angel. Poets call her the moon's confession, and philosophers quote her imagined aphorisms. Faith without laughter is tyranny. But among nuns, real nuns, quiet ones still keeping watch in cold chapels, she remains more than story. They still whisper to her, especially those who struggle with obedience, with silence, with the crushing weight of being perfect. They say that if you pray to her on the verge of despair, the candle nearest you will flicker twice, and for a moment you'll feel her hand on your shoulder. Warm, human, forgiving. A quirky artifact found in 1923 during restoration of an old Carmelite convent in Provence seems to confirm the continuity. Hidden inside the wall of the choir loft was a parchment sealed in wax. It read, in Latin, "To whoever finds this, if they ever forbid you laughter again, light this candle and remember me. I am not gone. I am merely between the verses." The wax bore an imprint, a small smile. You imagine her now not as a ghost in sheets of white, but as a presence in motion, a shimmer at the edge of vision when someone dares to grin during a sermon. A hand that steadies a novice's trembling when she spills wine and fears punishment. A breath of warmth in a confessional when words falter. Her haunting isn't vengeance, it's rehearsal. A rehearsal for the day the living remember that sanctity and joy were never meant to be enemies. Historians still debate whether she ever existed at all. But that's the trick, isn't it? The church kept the bones of saints in gilded boxes, yet none have ever produced hers. And maybe that's because she had none left to give. She'd already turned her body into metaphor. A modern theologian once wrote, "If she didn't exist, it was necessary to invent her." But perhaps she invented us our need to laugh, even as we kneel. In the present day, her shadow still stirs. Artists leave her likeness in street murals, a veiled woman with her head thrown back, laughing. Feminist scholars reclaim her as Europe's first comic philosopher. Psychologists cite her as a symbol of resilience, her laughter a tonic against despair. And in the quiet hours when churches stand empty and wind plays through cracked stained glass, janitors sometimes swear they hear a voice, distant but distinct, saying, "You missed a spot." Followed by laughter. You can picture her now, drifting through the cloisters she once walked in flesh. Bare feet, making no sound on cold stone. Fingertips brushing walls lined with centuries of prayers. She hums softly, pauses at an altar, and straightens a crooked candle. Still burning, she whispers, "Good has been to like ye for aiding miters." Then, turning toward the doorway where the night waits, she smiles wide, unrepentant, holy in a way no canon ever defined. Keep laughing, she says to no one and everyone. And with that, the air trembles just once, just enough for you to wonder whether the sound that follows is wind through the corridor, or the echo of her mirth still teaching stone to breathe. Centuries after her laughter first unsettled marble halls, she is no longer feared. She is studied. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest fate for any spirit born of rebellion, to be dissected by those who mistake warmth for evidence and wonder for error. It begins, as all obsessions do, in the quiet corners of academia. The 19th century births a generation of scholars eager to unearth the ghosts buried by dogma. In the age of rationalism and dust-covered libraries, they dig through Vatican archives, parish ledgers, and inquisitorial registers, searching for the real woman behind the myth of the laughing nun. Is not Rousseau life remain of the plane of the masters? They find fragments, letters half-burned, margins filled with doodled faces, and those occasional scribbled notes that historians love more than life itself. Sister Benedetta, defiant, apostate, unrepentant, dangerous, but strangely kind. One to the one jes, an unmighted deferent in posset. Somewhere between insult and admiration, she begins to live again. In 1843, a French historian named Jules Martineau publishes La Sœur du Vin, Études sur une hérésiarque inconnue, The Sister of Wine, a study of an unknown heretic. The book shocks the church but enthralls the public. Martineau calls her a saint excommunicated by solemnity, arguing that her laughter was not rebellion, but revelation. He reconstructs her life from scattered court documents and oral traditions, claiming she was born in 1318 as Benedetta de Caseneve, daughter of a minor Gascon baron. He even visits the ruins of a convent near Avignon, finding what he swears is her cell. There, etched faintly into the stone, he finds the words, "If silence is holy, why does it echo?" He rubs the inscription with charcoal, publishes the rubbing as proof, and ignites a storm. Priests denounce him, feminists adore him, and overnight, the so-called worst nun becomes the century's favorite muse of defiance. A mainstream fact. The 19th century was fascinated by fallen women saints turned sinners, sinners turned saints, heroines of contradiction. Writers like Flaubert and Hugo wove them into novels. Artists painted them half in shadow, half in light. Benedetta, if she existed, fit perfectly into that cultural hunger. Martineau's book inspires operas, poems, even a scandalous stage play in Paris titled La Non du Rire. In it, she seduces bishops with wit and rescues peasants with laughter. The play runs for 30 nights before the Archbishop of Paris shuts it down for irreverent grace, but the damage or the miracle is done. She's become a cultural virus once more. Other scholars follow. An Italian archivist, Lucia Ferranti, discovers a letter attributed to Father Tommaso, the inquisitor who once struck her. The letter, written in shaky Latin, confesses, "I did not condemn a woman but a mirror. She showed us ourselves too clearly. In one never died for enders." Ferranti publishes it in 1876, adding her own commentary. Perhaps holiness was never meant to be obedient. The Vatican refuses to acknowledge the document's authenticity, but Ferranti's career flourishes anyway. She becomes known as the Nuns historian, dedicating decades to tracing Benedetta's influence through folklore. Her most controversial theory, that the mysterious Sister of the Laughing Rosary, a 15th century mystic who reformed a convent in Provence, was one of Benedetta's secret disciples. Her theology traveled faster than parchment, Ferranti writes. She preached through imitation, not ink. Historians still debate her claim, but it draws the same conclusion as every serious study before and after, that the laughter didn't die with the body. In 1912, during an excavation beneath a collapsed abbey in Narbonne, workers discover a small chest sealed with wax. Inside, a tattered journal, wrapped in cloth. The ink has faded, the language a mix of Occitan and Latin, but experts later confirm it dates from the 14th century. The first legible line reads, "If God cannot take a joke, he should not have made mankind." And further down, "I have no quarrel with heaven, only with the men who charge rent for it." It's unsigned, but the handwriting flowing, deliberate matches a surviving trial record from Avignon. The discovery reignites fascination. The press calls it the Gospel of Laughter. Church officials call it a forgery dressed as blasphemy. The public calls it poetry. The debate stretches for decades. Even now, Paleographers argue over the handwriting's authenticity. Some insist it's hers, others say it was penned by a later imitator. But no one can deny its impact. For a brief, shimmering moment, she is resurrected not as ghost or saint, but as writer. By the 20th century, the scholars grow bolder. They reframe her story not as heresy but as the birth of a new language of faith, one rooted in empathy, irony, and the sacred absurd. An English theologian, Dr. Marion Gray, writes in 1959, her laughter was not denial, it was divine protest. She refused the solemn cruelty of dogma and replaced it with tenderness disguised as mischief. Gray coins the term theology of laughter. It inspires sermons, essays, even psychotherapy theories. In certain Catholic circles, young priests secretly read her work to remind themselves that holiness doesn't always look like discipline, it can look like joy. A quirky tidbit. In the 1970 seconds, a small monastery in southern Italy began celebrating an informal feast of the Laughing Nun every April 13th. They baked bread shaped like smiling faces and passed wine while reading her sayings aloud. When the Vatican found out, they quietly told them to stop. The monks complied, but only publicly. The tradition continues to this day, under a different name. Festa della Gioia non tacita, Feast of Unquiet Joy. By the dawn of the digital age, she becomes something new again, an online myth, shared on forums and academic blogs. Artists remix her words into modern slogans. Faith should giggle. Laugh is prayer. She refused to burn, so she became light. Every generation remakes her face, sometimes a cloaked nun, sometimes a rebel poet, sometimes a hologram of laughter rising from centuries of fear. But through it all, the scholars keep hunting for the definitive truth. Was she real? Historians still argue. Their debates equal parts reverence and rivalry. Some point to linguistic traces. Her Occitan phrasing in rural sermons, her rumored correspondence with exiled mystics, her influence on 14th century satire. Others dismiss her entirely as a feminist fabrication, a myth invented by women who needed a symbol of defiant holiness. But even that dismissal grants her what she always wanted: endurance through contradiction. In 2003, a symposium at the Sorbonne titled Benedetta and the Theology of Joy gathers historians, philosophers, and priests under the same roof. The keynote speaker, an aging Jesuit scholar named Father Alain Lemoyne, delivers a stunning confession. For 50 years, I searched for the real Benedetta. I read her supposed words, traced her alleged relics, examined the archives, but I found nothing I could prove. And yet, and to set how people, who would have to 40 might have been. He pauses, smiling faintly. Every time I laughed while reading scripture, I heard her voice. Every time I forgave myself for being human, I felt her hand. Perhaps that's all she ever wanted, to make faith feel alive enough to smile back. The audience falls silent. Then, one by one, they laugh, not mockingly, but softly, like a choir rediscovering breath. That moment, unrecorded in official minutes, becomes a legend among scholars. The night an academic conference turned into mass. A mainstream fact, buried beneath centuries of argument. Medieval convents were not monoliths of silence. Many nuns were literate, politically active, even rebellious within boundaries. Some wrote plays, painted icons, brewed beer. Others, like Marguerite Porete or Hildegard of Bingen, pushed theology toward poetry. Benedetta, or whoever she was, fit neatly into that lineage of dangerous women who mistook intelligence for faith, and vice versa. But Benedetta alone made laughter her scripture. And that's what keeps scholars awake at night, not whether she existed, but how she could have existed then. In an age when joy was suspicion, when obedience was oxygen, how did one woman find enough breath to laugh? Even now, in the Vatican's secret archives, sealed in a climate-controlled chamber, lies a curious item catalogued under Unverified Mystical Correspondence, 14th century. It's a single sheet of vellum bearing 6 words in Latin, written in the same slanted hand found in Avignon's trial ledger. Risus est lingua anime fidelis. Laughter is the language of the faithful soul. No date, no signature, just that. The archivists can't agree on its origin. Some think it's a forgery. Others whisper it was smuggled out of her trial by a sympathetic scribe. But they keep it anyway behind glass, under lock, as though even after all this time, it might still be contagious. You can almost imagine her in that sterile room, standing beside the glass, smiling at the irony. "So now I'm an exhibit," she'd murmur. "Well, at least they've learned how to preserve me." Then she'd tap the case once, and somewhere, a monk filing papers would start laughing for no reason. The scholar's obsession, in the end, says less about her and more about us, about our endless need to translate the ineffable into footnotes, to tame wonder with grammar, yet every attempt to define her slips because laughter, like grace, refuses enclosure. She remains an unfinished thesis, a rumor that refuses to stay academic. Her story lives not in the archives but in the cracks between laughter and reverence, where belief becomes something tender again. Even now, perhaps, as you sit here, a scholar in your own right listening to the creak of time, reading her through the dust, you might feel it too. That faint hum beneath the logic, that pull towards something too human to name. You can almost hear her whisper through the centuries. "Keep writing, my learned ones, but remember some truths prefer to dance." That was Cineandry, and maybe that's why, even after hundreds of years, her name still appears in bibliographies. Her myth still mutates into meaning, and her laughter, her laughter still echoes across the shelves of history like an unrepentant hymn. By now, her name has drifted so far from flesh that it wears 100 faces. The scholars may argue in polished Latin, and theologists may frown from behind parchment walls, but the people, the simple, storytelling kind, never cared for records. They remember her in songs, in fables, in the way a laugh can save a life. She belongs not to history anymore but to imagination, where truth and invention walk arm in arm. You could spend a lifetime trying to separate one from the other. And many have. In the markets of Gascony, the old women still tell children to behave, or the smiling sister will steal your tongue. They mean it half as warning, half as comfort. In the vineyards of Languedoc, vintners pour a splash of the first press onto the ground, for the nun who taught God to drink. In Brittany, a fisherman's prayer ends, even now, with, "Bless her who makes the sea laugh, before it drowns us." These aren't devotions sanctioned by Rome. They are something deeper, an inherited instinct that refuses to bow entirely, a superstition that remembers her spirit better than Scripture does. But with devotion always comes distortion. The longer a story travels, the more it molds. In one version, she's a witch who tricked the devil into confessing his sins. In another, she's an angel cast out for tickling God during prayer. Some say she turned to laughter after watching her entire convent die of plague. Others swear she sold her soul for a single glass of wine that never emptied. Each legend bears her shape but not her skin. You can almost see the centuries, layering exaggeration over simplicity, like gilt over plain wood. And yet beneath the embroidery there is still that pulse of something unmistakably real, that voice whispering from behind every variation. Don't take your faith too seriously, it might die of suffocation. A mainstream fact. In folklore studies, stories like hers are called migratory legends. They adapt to their landscape, shifting details but keeping the core, a moral, an emotion, a ghost of a name. Her laughter became that core, the heartbeat traveling through generations. By the 1600s, she is no longer just the laughing nun but an archetype. Painters in Italy begin depicting her face in works labeled Allegoria della Gioia Divina, Allegory of Divine Joy. Poets invoke her to mock hypocrisy, preachers denounce her to fill pews, and somehow, she becomes both sin and salvation, light and heresy, saint and joke. One engraving from 1634, found in a Venetian chapel, shows her standing barefoot on a pile of broken rosaries. In one hand, she holds a goblet of wine, in the other, a candle that refuses to melt. Her expression is mischievous, almost tender. Below it, a single phrase in Latin, Ridet in aeternum. She laughs forever. The artist, anonymous for fear of excommunication, left no other works. But that print survives, tucked between dusty theology treatises, as though the scholars themselves couldn't bear to throw her away. As centuries turn, the lines blur further. Her laughter spreads like yeast, feeding every story that needs rebellion, every heart that needs warmth. In the 18th century, a Jesuit pamphlet claims she reappeared during the Lisbon earthquake, walking through rubble, calming the dying with jokes. "Laugh," she was said to have told them, "so the fear doesn't finish before you do." During the French Revolution, another tale arises. That a veiled woman stood between firing squads and peasants, telling the soldiers, "Aim true, or God will laugh at your aim. They should disgame. And there's a station right?" Of course, none of these accounts bear proof. Historians still debate whether they were invented to soothe fear or to stir courage. But that's how lies work best. They attach themselves to whatever wound is open. A quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, a rural priest in Provence banned his parishioners from singing a certain harvest song. Its chorus went, "Drink to the nun who never knelt divided by, and laugh until the saints are felt." He called it the devil's lullaby. Within a year, the entire region was singing it louder than ever. Her myth had learned the one lesson no theology ever masters: irreverence travels faster than command. By the dawn of the industrial age, she takes on a new form, folk rebellion wrapped in silk. Newspapers publish serialized romances based loosely on her life. Painters reinvent her as muse. Revolutionaries quote her wit in pamphlets. She becomes the patron saint of actresses and poets, courtesans and dissenters, any woman told to hush. They wear her likeness on lockets laughing, not praying. And each time the church tries to suppress her image, another artist paints her again, brighter, freer. By the time photography arrives, her face is everybody's. But the lies don't always flatter. In darker corners, she's recast as a warning. Protestant reformers call her Babylon's harlot, proof of Catholic corruption. Puritans call her the witch of laughter. Victorians, too prim for nuance, turn her into a cautionary tale about female indulgence. Maybe one to be a braid hast. Maybe one to be a braid hast. In each retelling, men remake her into the thing they fear most: freedom disguised as mirth. A mainstream observation from scholars of folklore. The persistence of a fallen holy woman. Myth mirrors social anxiety about power and grace. The laughing nun was never dangerous because she mocked God. She was dangerous because she made faith contagious without hierarchy. Still, the stories keep evolving. In Ireland, she becomes Bridget's companion spirit, said to bless anyone who shares bread without asking who's hungry first. In Poland, soldiers swear she rides alongside Saint Michael during battle, laughing as bullets miss their mark. In Greece, she's reborn as a half-pagan trickster Sister Thalassa, goddess of humor and tide. The theologians call this corruption. The poets call it proof. And somewhere between both, her ghost just keeps laughing. One legend, popular among French peasants, tells of her final miracle, the wedding at Montélimar. It says she appeared during a famine when a village had nothing to offer but despair. She gathered the townsfolk, baked one loaf of bread, poured one jug of wine, and somehow fed everyone. But unlike the biblical version, there's no solemnity here. The witnesses say she made them dance first. "You must chew joy before you taste mercy," she told them. Historians, naturally, dismiss it as parody of the Gospels. But pilgrims still visit Montélimar each spring to share wine and bread outdoors. They call it La Fête du Rire Béni, the Feast of Blessed Laughter. Not all who study her can stomach the contradictions. A 20th century Jesuit scholar named François Delorme spent 30 years trying to prove she was a composite myth, a quilt sewn from real nuns' scandals. He published 3 dense volumes debunking every miracle, but in his private diary, later discovered after his death, he wrote, "I do not believe she existed. Yet when I prayed for peace, I heard her laugh in the dark, and I laughed too, and found it." Perhaps that's the paradox her story leaves behind. Even disbelief becomes another kind of devotion. Historians still argue, was she rebel or saint, heretic or prophet, invention or inevitability? But the question misses the point. What matters isn't whether she was, but that she became the breath between rules, the smile between sins, the space in which grace dared to exhale. Even her name bends with the wind. Benedetta, Benita, Benedicte. Sometimes she's nameless entirely, just the one who laughed. It doesn't matter. She's everywhere. Laughter refuses to bow. A quirky archaeological note. In 1987, restorers cleaning frescoes in a ruined Italian abbey uncovered a hidden mural. It depicts a cloaked woman standing before a crowd of peasants. She holds her hand out, palm up, and from her open mouth flows not light, but ribbons of painted laughter, delicate curls of gold spiraling into the air. Beneath, in faded Latin, risus non moritur, laughter does not die. The church called it a curious allegory. The tourists called it beautiful. but locals still light candles beneath it every spring. You begin to see that lies, once entwined with wonder, aren't lies anymore. They're defense mechanisms of memory. When the truth threatens to vanish, legend takes over the work of survival. She has become her own scripture, constantly rewritten, endlessly translated, never silenced. She doesn't belong to Rome now, nor to scholars or skeptics or saints. She belongs to anyone who's ever whispered a prayer between giggles, who's ever defied despair with a smirk. You can almost hear her even now across centuries of retelling, amused by our efforts to contain her. "Careful," she might say, "your facts are showing." And then she'd laugh again, not cruelly, but with the easy mercy of someone who understands that myth, too, is a form of forgiveness. So the legends go on, weaving her into every century's fears and hopes. And maybe that's the point she was trying to make all along. That holiness, like humor, isn't about being right, it's about being alive. Because while facts can fade, laughter has the indecency to echo. And somewhere, in that echo between faith and folly, between legend and lie, you can still feel her smiling. By the time the world tires of arguing whether she ever lived, she has already won. Her name, her voice, her laughter, these have outlasted every decree, every dusty archive, every scholar's correction. You can bury bones, you cannot bury breath. And what she left behind was exactly that. A long, unbroken exhale of defiance disguised as mirth. The story begins to close where all human stories do, in the quiet recognition that myths are simply truths that have learned to survive in disguise. But let's go back once more, to that woman who might have been real, sitting by her final fire. The year is uncertain, the hills around her are dry, the sky painted with the faint copper of late summer. She has outlived the generation that hunted her, the generation that worshipped her, and perhaps even herself. Her hands tremble when she lifts the cup, but her eyes are still sharp, amused at everything and nothing. She listens to the crackle of wood and says, almost fondly, "So this is how legends end, like jokes told one time too many." The wind laughs for her, shaking the trees as if applauding. She is old now, very old. Her silver hair catches the moonlight, her voice thinner but still dangerous, still edged with joy. The children in nearby villages say an old nun lives alone on the mountain, that she tells stories to foxes and keeps company with ghosts. Their parents smile indulgently and call her La Vieille Bénie, the blessed old one, but they still leave bread and wine at the edge of the forest. One evening, a traveler, a scholar perhaps, or a lost pilgrim finds her tending a small garden behind a crumbling chapel. He recognizes her instantly, though he doesn't believe in ghosts. "You're her," he whispers. "The laughing nun," she chuckles, wiping soil from her hands. "Am I?" Depends who's telling it this time. He falls to his knees, weeping, mumbling confessions. "I've read everything. They call you heretic, saint, poet, witch." She interrupts gently. "Ah, titles. Heavy things for such small shoulders. Then what are you?" he asks. She looks up, eyes bright as dawn. "A reminder," she says, "that holiness was never supposed to be afraid of happiness. The sliding this safe, and 10 you wide." He stays the night, unable to leave. She feeds him stew and stories. By morning, she's gone vanished into mist, leaving only laughter echoing through the trees and the faint scent of wine and thyme. The traveler writes of it years later, though no one believes him. That becomes her final recorded miracle. A mainstream fact. Sometime between 1378 and 1380, records of a wandering sister in the Languedoc hills abruptly stop. The Papal Inquisition, then distracted by the Western Schism, never pursued the case. Rome split between two popes, each accusing the other of heresy, while the woman they once condemned simply disappeared, perhaps into legend, perhaps into peace. Historians still argue whether she died or ascended metaphorically into folklore, but the effect is the same. She escaped. The only mortal ever to outwit both church and death with nothing more than a laugh. And what remains after her? A trail of laughter-shaped footprints across Europe's memory, songs half-remembered, candles carved with smiling faces, and, somewhere, deep in the Vatican archives, a sealed folio labeled Risus Benedete, the matter of the laughing sister. Inside, a note in faded ink reads simply, "Let it rest, the joke is on us." It's unsigned. Centuries slide past. Empires rise, fall, and get tired of doing both. The faith she mocked reshapes itself 1,000 times over, until the prayers once whispered against her sound strangely like the things she said aloud. Joy as mercy, grace as laughter, forgiveness as freedom, brisen, and then omings of the debilitating beat. The theologians of later centuries call it pastoral empathy, but you can almost hear her muttering from beyond time. Just call it kindness, and be done with it. A quirky tidbit. In 1994, Pope John Paul II declared that laughter is a sign of the soul's health. His speechwriters likely thought they were quoting philosophy. They were quoting her. The world grows noisier, faster, hungrier for entertainment. Yet somewhere under the digital static, her story keeps surfacing. You can find her now on glowing screens, a meme, a short film, a whispered bedtime legend about the nun who laughed at God and was loved anyway. In Spain, a band names itself Sir Duveen. In Italy, a feminist collective publishes a magazine called Ridere Sanctum Holy Laughter. In France, her old title reappears as a podcast about rebellious women, La Pierre Non du Moyen Âge. You could say she's gone viral again, but that's only fitting. Contagion was always her language. And still, historians can't help but chase her ghost. They gather at conferences with clever titles, the hagiography of humor, transgressive piety, the feminine, divine, and subversive joy. They argue over handwriting, dialect, authorship. They publish papers with footnotes so precise they forget what beating heart began the story. But every once in a while, one of them slips. They'll write something they shouldn't, something warm, human, almost prayerful, and you can tell the infection's still spreading. A young professor once ended her lecture on Benedetta with this line: "If she were alive today, she would not tweet theology. She'd post a joke so pure it healed." The students laughed. That was the truest homage anyone could give her. So what, finally, was she? Maybe she was never one woman at all, but a collage of courage stitched from fragments of nuns who doubted, thieves who prayed, peasants who dared to laugh in the face of power. Maybe she was simply the church's guilty conscience given a feminine form. Or maybe she was, impossibly, exactly who the stories said she was. A single human being who discovered that joy was stronger than fear. Historians still debate whether she ever truly performed miracles. But perhaps the real miracle was survival not of the body, but of the idea that the divine could smile. A mainstream fact, in many medieval mystic texts, God is described as the Great Silence. But there exists one anonymous 14th century manuscript that dares to disagree. It calls him the Great Laughter. No one knows who wrote it. The ink, analysis suggests, came from southern France. The hand, familiar. Time softens everything. Once, she was excommunication. Now, she is curiosity. Once, her name was burned from registers. Now, it's taught in university courses. Once, she was the worst nun in medieval history. Now, she's a reminder that holiness, like rebellion, is just another form of longing, and you, listening in the quiet, can feel her still, her voice brushing the edge of your mind, light as candle smoke. "Do you see?" she whispers. "They called me worst, but I was simply first." You smile. You can't help it. Imagine her last moment not as execution, not as death, but as release. She stands at the edge of some nameless hill, wind roaring around her, eyes bright with the same mischief that once undid bishops and beggars alike. Her cloak snaps like laughter in the storm. Behind her, the world burns with argument. Ahead, an endless sky. She looks upward, not pleading, not fearful, just curious. "All right then," she murmurs. "Tell me the punchline." The wind carries her voice into eternity. And maybe that's where she's been ever since, somewhere between heaven and heresy, telling jokes to saints who finally learned to laugh back. If you listen closely, you might still catch her presence in small things. In the sudden warmth that follows sorrow, in the half-smile that rises during prayer, in the quiet chuckle that slips through a eulogy when grief becomes too heavy to bear. She's there in every laugh that refuses to apologize. And now, as this long story drifts toward its own silence, imagine her beside you, the candle nearly gone, the night soft around its edges. She sits across from you, elbows on the table, chin resting on her hand, eyes glimmering with that same old mirth. "So," she says, "you stayed awake all this time just to hear me out?" You nod. "Good," she whispers. Because laughter is the one sermon worth losing sleep for. Right no. I'm sedation have zero rays, 4 of this mark. She leans back, exhales, and the flame wavers once. Then she's gone, leaving only warmth, and the faint, impossible sound of someone still laughing, somewhere far beyond the reach of doctrine. And so, you exhale. Slowly. The story lingers like incense, sweet, strange, a little irreverent. You picture the roads she walked, the cloisters she haunted, the faces she changed with nothing but laughter and audacity. The echoes fade, and what remains isn't scandal or miracle, but calm, a sense that holiness doesn't have to whisper. It can laugh softly too. You lean back. The candlelight around you pools like liquid gold. Every sound in the room feels distant now. The hum of the fan, the heartbeat under your ribs, the small rhythm of your breath keeping time with history. You realize that her defiance wasn't rage, it was gentleness, refusing to be crushed. She laughed, not to mock, but to remind the world that faith without joy becomes fear. And maybe, just maybe, that reminder is why she's still here, hundreds of years later, visiting quiet minds like yours when the night gets too heavy. Outside, the world turns slowly toward dawn. You let it. You've traveled through centuries tonight, through rebellion, legend, and laughter, and somehow returned to peace. Close your eyes, let her final echo settle in your chest. Feel it there, steady and kind. She would tell you, breathe lighter, love foolishly, and never trust anyone who forbids laughter. Now, let sleep come like a slow blessing. The story is over. The laughter isn't.